From 1974 to 1985, the monster of Florence coldly killed 7 young unmarried couples, 14 people in total, and possibly another couple in 1968. The serial killer's impact was large. The culture of Florence was substantially altered due to his dark, looming presence. The monster of Florence only ever used 2 weapons over the course of his killing spree, a .22 caliber Beretta handgun and a scuba knife. The location of his kills, always the same, the magnificent wooded hills that surround the Italian city of Florence. He targeted couples having sex in parked vehicles, and from 4 of his female victims, this serial killer took a disturbing trophy: their vaginas, which he brutally and meticulously severed whole from their bodies using that scuba knife. And as darkly fascinating as the horrible crimes of the monster of Florence are, the investigation into catching him, I feel, is far more fascinating. Throughout the course of the convoluted investigation into the monster, so many clues were neglected or ignored. So much legitimate evidence was dismissed, other evidence was planted, wild accusations were thrown haphazardly at anyone they might stick to, and there was a whole bunch of talk about a secret satanic cabal behind the killings. The main characters in this story are actually not the monster and his victims, but an award-winning Italian investigative journalist named Mario Spezzi and accomplished American author of crime novels, Douglas Preston, both of whom became inextricably entangled in the case when they joined forces to write about it in the early 2000s, and both of whom laid out a case for who the real killer very possibly was in a way that several teams of investigators working on this case for roughly 5 decades have never been able to do. Today we're going to meet each person that has ever been officially suspected of being the monster, examine the evidence against them, investigate how an investigation could go so terribly wrong, and ultimately by the end, we'll maybe even determine who the monster of Florence really was. In another serial killing, corrupt court of justice, premarital sex gets you killed, true crime, Maserati, Bugatti, spaghetti, does justice ever get served in Italy? Edition of Timesuck.
This is Michael McDonald, and you're listening to Timesuck.
You're listening to Timesuck.
Well, happy Monday and welcome to the Cult of the Curious. I'm Dan Cummins, a master sucker, newest member of the Galactic Federation of Light team. Hell yeah! And John Lennon's Starship co-pilot, button pusher. This button last week.
Ding! Yippee!
And you are listening to Timesuck. Hail Nimrod, hail Josephina, praise be to good boy Bojangles, and glory be to Triple M. I hope everybody is having a great summer. And a big thanks to the new listeners who have found this show, the people who have rated and reviewed it recently. That still helps so much. The listeners who have become Patreon Space Lizards recently, and the OG Space Lizards and OG listeners who continue to support this strange product. I appreciate all of you beautiful bastards, and I hope you find today's show as entertaining as I did. Before I really dig in, just quick word to any Italian listeners. I am very aware that there are many smart, logical, decent, hardworking, etc. All the good adjectives, Italian people. Just like there are smart, logical, decent people in every nation and every culture, of every race. That being said, many of the Italians that I will be mentioning in this story, oh boy, highly superstitious, completely illogical, frankly, fucking idiots, easily prone to hysteria, who seem mostly motivated in life by trying to fuck anything and everything that moves and blaming everything that goes wrong on the devil. Oh boy. This is the second episode I've done that heavily involves the modern Italian legal system, the first being episode 330 about Amanda Knox. And just like in that episode, I found the Italian judicial system to be an embarrassing and wildly corrupt farce, virtually lacking any real justice. And it's the same is true today in today's episode. I firmly believe that the actual monster of Florence could have definitely been arrested, but was not, because the investigation into him was ran by just this cadre of law enforcement officers and magistrates, just confusingly, maddeningly bad at their jobs. The good news about that is that this episode turned out to be way more comedically entertaining than I assumed it would be going in. So let's begin. Get used to that Mario button. In their co-written nonfiction novel, The Monster of Florence, a True Story, published in 2008, author Douglas Preston writes, in the spring of 2001, Mario Spezzi and I set out to find the truth and track down the real killer. This book is the story of that search and our eventual meeting with the man we believe may be the monster of Florence. Along the way, Spezzi and I fell into the story. I was accused of being an accessory to murder, planting false evidence, perjury, and obstruction of justice, and threatened with arrest if I ever set foot on Italian soil again. Spezzi fared worse. He was accused of being the monster of Florence himself. Yeah, we're going to begin today's episode by familiarizing ourselves with the culture of 1960s Florence, such a historic and beautiful city, as well as cover a little bit of history about the Tuscan capital. After that, we'll jump into a pretty hefty, fascinating, infuriating timeline of the investigation and the killings. Here comes that background. In The Monster of Florence, a true story, Douglas Preston writes, many countries have a serial killer who defines his culture by a process of negation, who exemplifies his era not by exalting its values, but by exposing its black underbelly. England had Jack the Ripper, born in the fogs of Dickensian London, who preyed on the city's most neglected underclass, the prostitutes who scrabbled for a living in the slums of Whitechapel. Boston had the Boston Strangler, that suave, handsome killer who prowled the city's more elegant neighborhoods, raping and murdering elderly women and arranging their bodies in a tableau of unspeakable obscenity. Germany had the monster of Dusseldorf, who seemed to foreshadow the coming of Hitler by indiscriminate and sadistic killing of men, women, and children. His bloodlust was so great that, on the eve of his execution, he called his imminent beheading the pleasure to end all pleasures. Each killer was, in his own way, a dark embodiment of its time and place. Italy had the monster of Florence. And just real quick, do you remember the monster of Dusseldorf, a.k.a. the vampire of Dusseldorf, a.k.a. Peter Kürten, that hammer-happy psychopath we covered here in episode 253? I forgot about him. So brutal, stabbing elderly women and children alike with scissors, smashing the fuck out of people with hammers, raping both people and animals, ejaculating at the sight of blood like Andre Chikatilo. He liked to wrestle as well. Fucking crazy. Back to Florence. As the Monster of Florence case unfolded, it dragged out of the dark and into the light scandalizing aspects of Italian culture that occasionally shocked people more than the actual killings. The sexual habits of young people, specifically young unmarried people, was one such uncomfortable truth this very Catholic nation was forced to deal with during this period. In 1970, Italy became one of the last Western nations in the world to legalize divorce. It was still illegal to get a divorce in 1969 due to the church's powerful influence. Like I said earlier, the monster targeted very specific victims, unmarried couples, having sex in cars in the hills surrounding Florence. Luckily for this killer, finding two people that fit this criteria, not a difficult task. In Italy, both today and back then, though today it's slightly less common, the overwhelming majority of young people live with their parents until they get married, and most do not marry until their mid to late 20s. Because of this, Preston wrote, having sex in parked cars is a national pastime. It has been said that 1 out of every 3 Florentines alive today was conceived in a car. That's fucking crazy. On any given weekend night, the hills surrounding Florence were filled with young couples sparked in shadowy lanes and dirt turnouts in olive groves and farmers' fields. Well, hail Lucifina! Sounds pretty fun. Playing a lot of backseat bingo. No church or government has ever kept young people, in general, from fucking before marriage, and that'll never happen. Man, when there is a will, there is a way, and when it comes to sex, there's so much will. As the case of the monster continued to go unsolved, horny couples trying to smash outside of mom and dad's earshot were forced to abandon the woods and find sweet sexual refuge elsewhere, like in their parents' bedrooms. Yes, Father, we are fucking at the foot of your bed. We refuse to hide our love any longer. So take a good hard look at my lover's good hard dick, Daddy. That didn't happen. At least not that I know of. Be it out of stupidity, desperation to get their dicks and or clits wet, or fearlessness in the face of a serial killer, throughout the 1980s, hundreds of couples continued to travel into the woods at night, and some of them never made it out. In addition to the countless number of couples having sinful, premarital, probably super fucking hot and passionate car sex in the woods each night, so many shrub sluts. The investigation also inadvertently exposed another nocturnal group occupying those very same hills. This was my favorite part of the episode. An assemblage of sexual voyeurs, locally known as the Indiani. In English, the word Indiani translates to the Indians. That is not what it means in this context. It was slang for a shady group of pervs, given this pretty blatantly racist nickname, because of the way that they crept around in the dark. During the 1980s, each night, and 1970s as well, dozens, if not hundreds of Indiani scattered across the Florentine hills, hiding in the thick foliage and waiting to watch young lovers fuck in their cars. That's crazy. Reminds me of all of my friends in college who went on this kind Gonzaga in Florence year-long study abroad program that they've had every year at Gonzaga for decades and decades. Gonzaga has a satellite campus in Florence, Italy, and I visited friends studying there for several days in 1997. And some of my friends who were girls talked about peeping Toms. And I remember these conversations because my mind was blown about how brazen these peepers were. I have distinct memories of two different girls who said that when they went for their morning jogs, like if they ended up varying their morning jog routines, because if they stuck to the same path and the same time, dudes would know that they were running and would watch them and just beat off. Like these two girls, different guys. One was on his balcony, and one I think was behind his window in his home. I remember the balcony story the most, where she would just run and she had to, obviously change her route because this guy would just be on his balcony, fucking no pants, just didn't care, like that his dick was fully exposed, just blatantly beating off, like eye contact, just like no shame, like it's just a normal thing to do. Anecdotally, it seems that for much of recent history, being a fucking creepy, pervy dude is just pretty common in, Florence, just an accepted part of life. According to Preston, when these pervs went out to spy on couples, some Indiani were so dedicated to being pervs that they carried, quote, sophisticated electronic equipment, including parabolic and suction cup microphones, tape recorders, and night vision cameras. This isn't something these guys were doing once or twice. Like, this was a fucking way of life for them. Some people take up bird watching for a hobby. Some people get into model trains. These guys got into spying on young couples fuck while they watched and beat off in the woods. Like a huge community of guys doing this. Because these pervs, quote, worked in the same area and kept the same hours as the monster of Florence, while investigating the killer, the police found themselves having to delve deeper and deeper into this unsettling and crowded world of peeping Toms on the Florentine hills. And what they found was just so bizarre. As is written in The Monster of Florence, a true story, the Indiani had divided the hills into zones of operation, each managed by a group or tribe who controlled the best posts for vicarious sex watching. Some posts were highly sought after, either because they allowed for very close observation or because they were where the good cars were most commonly found. A good car is exactly what you might imagine. A good car could also be a source of money, and sometimes good cars were bought and sold on the spot in a kind of depraved stock market, in which one Indiano would retire with a fistful of cash, ceding his pot to another to watch the finish. Wealthy Indiani often paid for a guide to take them to the best spots and minimize risk. People were paying fucking guides to take them into the hills and watch young lovers fucking cars. Dudes were building side hustles, like businesses, off of this. What do you do for work, Angelo? It's a bit of a tourist guide. Oh, that's fun. Do you take people like the Piazza del Duomo, Ponte Vecchio, go see the statue of David? Well, I mostly take all the perverts, how you say, into the woods to sneak around to watch the younger people to fucking the cars. It's fucking insane. That'd be somebody's job. Also, a good car was a car known to have especially attractive women fucking inside of it. So they weren't, like the guys in the hills, they weren't buying or selling the actual cars if there was any confusion there. They were just buying and selling, access to view these cars. Like the best hidden spots with the hottest people fucking in them. I actually feel sorry for these losers. Like, how pathetic have you let yourself become when you're paying another pervert to have them give up their prime peeping spot in the woods for you for that night to beat off? While investigating the monster of Florence in 1981, the police also discovered that buried within the Indiani subculture of Florence existed yet another micro-society of creeps, the creeps that preyed on those creeps. At night, just like with the Indiani, this group of men would venture into the dark woodland hills surrounding Tuscany's capital, hide themselves away in the shadows and the trees. But instead of spying on the young people fucking, these guys would come to the hills to spy on the people spying on the young people fucking. And they would take notes on who these peeping Toms were, take photos of them with their, night vision cameras, catch them jerking off or whatever, and then use those photos and evidence to blackmail them. That was another, side little industry off of this. There's just a whole hidden, layered subculture in the hills around Florence, an entire microeconomy based exclusively around people fucking in cars. Another buried thread of Italy's fabric that the Monster of Florence case unraveled was not a nefarious subculture like the Indiani, but a forgotten part of its history. And that was the mass immigration from the island of Sardinia to the mainland in the 1960s. Sardinia, the second largest island in the Mediterranean, slightly smaller than the island of Sicily, the largest one, and one of 20 different regions of Italy. However, its people have long viewed themselves as a very distinct, separate culture from Italy. Nowadays, Sardinia boasts a legion of million-dollar seaside resorts, stunning golf courses, fine dining establishments, lots of other luxury-type tourist activities. However, back in the 60s, as Mario Spezzi wrote, the poorest, most backward area in all of Italy was the barren, sun-baked interior mountains of the island of Sardinia. Back then, almost nobody in Sardinia spoke Italian, using instead a language all their own, Lugodorese, considered to be the oldest and least contaminated of all the Romance languages. I did not know about that language. That language today just generally referred to as Sardinian. In the 1960s, amidst the massive industrialization of Italy, thousands of Sardinians emigrated from their island to the mainland to find factory jobs. And most of these immigrants landed in the heart of Tuscany, the region of central Italy that has Florence as its capital. Despite joining the masses on the mainland, the Sardinians still lived by an entirely separate set of rules that had long been at the center of Sardinian culture, the Barbagian Code. Again, per the authors of The Monster of Florence, a true story, at the heart of the Barbagian Code was the man known as the Balente, the wily outlaw, the man of cunning, skill, and courage who takes care of his own. Stealing, particularly livestock, was an exalted activity under the Barbagian Code when it was committed against another tribe, because aside from mere gain, it was a heroic act. The thief, by stealing, demonstrated his cunning and his superiority to his adversary, who paid a just price for his incapacity to take care of his own property and flocks. Kidnapping and even murder were justified under similar rules. The Balente had to be feared and respected. So this mythic esteem that Sardinia, the Sardinian people held for who they considered to be a just outlaw amongst them would end up playing a pretty big role in the search for the Monster of Florence. Investigators had a very hard time getting anyone who was Sardinian to rat on one of their own. So now let's head to Sardinia, where our timeline begins.
Strap on those boots, soldier. We're marching down a Timesuck timeline.
On January 14th, 1961, on the Italian island of Sardinia, a 17-year-old girl named Barbarina is found dead in her bed with scratches on her face and bruises around her neck. Bruises that clearly point to strangulation. Scratches that point to her being attacked and fighting with whoever strangled her. Also found in the room with Barbarina's body is an open tank of propane gas. And because of this, her death is ruled a suicide. Because obviously no one could have ever just easily placed this tank of propane in her room and then opened it after very obviously strangling her. No way, that would be impossible. Most people in the Sardinian town of Villacidro, where she lived, believed Barbarina had been murdered by her new husband, Salvatore Vinci. About a year before her untimely death, at only 16 years old, young Barbarina was dating a local boy named Antonio. Unbeknownst to her, Antonio was despised by one of the town's gangsters, Salvatore Vinci. In order to humiliate Antonio, and because he was a rapist, one afternoon, Salvatore ambushed Barbarina, dragged her into a nearby field, and violently raped her. Soon after the assault, Barbarina discovered she was pregnant with Salvatore's child, and then at the behest of religion and for the sake of her family's honor, she was then pressured to marry her rapist. And that little cultural difference is real fucking hard for me to understand. Truly can't imagine as a father and just as a human being with some empathy, who at least tries not to be a piece of shit, how the fuck could you do that? How could you, to your fucking child? It's only right, The thing you do here is to marry your rapist. If you don't want to marry your rapist, you should not let yourself get raped, okay? Do you understand, Jenna? Fucking crazy. Sorry. Oh my God, stop! I hit that button twice, got in a bad cycle with it, and it seizured. 9 months later, Barbarina gave birth to a little boy. According to Preston, everyone in town knew that Salvatore mistreated her, that he beat her, didn't give her enough money to eat, just enough to buy milk for the baby. The baby was her only happiness. She named him Antonio after her great love and continued to see her first lover on the sly. And then Salvatore learned of his wife's infidelity in November of 1960 when somebody took pictures of Barbarina and Antonio, her boyfriend, not her son, sneaking off into the countryside together. A little over a month later, God, wouldn't you know it? Barbarina was dead. Rumors quickly circulated that Salvatore was the one who killed her. Sure seems likely based on this situation. Eventually, the community's outrage at the likely rapist and murderer forced Salvatore Vinci, along with his older brother Giovanni and his younger brother Francesco, to flee the island of Sardinia. And this rape and murder not the only source of outrage against this despicable family. Giovanni had been shunned by the small community years prior when he allegedly raped his youngest sister. And Francesco feared for his penchant for violence, also known to beat the women he dated. Of these three brothers, Francesco was actually the one known as the Valente, the macho just outlaw I mentioned earlier. So in 1961, the three Vinci brothers took a ferry to the mainland, landed in Tuscany, and just stayed there for many, many, many years. Once in Tuscany, the brothers each went their own ways. Francesco took to hanging around a few shady bars known to serve as the unofficial headquarters of the Sardinian gangster scene in Florence, committing petty crimes to get by. Like a minor mafioso type. Salvatore, on the other hand, found work as a bricklayer, rented a room in the home of some fellow Sardinian immigrants, the Mele family. We'll meet them. Giovanni found work as a sister raper. Like if you didn't want to rape your sister, but you wanted your sister raped, you would just give him a call. You get the job done. It's me, Giovanni. I'm here to do some raping. I'm not sure what he did. Sources don't say. Jumping 7 years ahead now to the first suspected murders committed by the monster of Florence. Maybe. Some don't consider this first pair of murders being connected to the next 7. Others do. So sometimes when I refer to later murders, like when I talk about like 4 pairs of killings, I'll make it clear, but sometimes not including this one. But but this one does tie into the other murders, at the very least. On the evening of August 21st, 1968, 29-year-old Antonio Lobianco and 32-year-old Barbara Locci shot to death in Antonio's white Alfa Romeo while Barbara's 6-year-old son, Natalino, was in the back seat, supposedly sleeping. What a nightmare for that poor little kid. Barbara was originally from Sardinia, but moved to Tuscany as a teenager to marry a fellow Sardinian man named Stefano Mele. Stefano, in addition to being 20 years older than his young wife, very non-confrontational, very meek, mild-mannered. When he and Barbara were wed, she moved into the Mele family home where Stefano lived with his siblings and their father, which sounds fucking terrible. I'm glad to live with your family like that is not the cultural norm in this country. As soon as she moved into the Mele homestead, Barbara is said to have become a problem. She was openly flirty with other men. She disliked dressing modestly, preferred to wear tight red skirts that accentuated her curvy figure, had a penchant for stealing money from her husband's family, sneaking out of the house at night to go dancing at clubs without her husband. And then oftentimes she would sneak the men she met out in the town back into the Mele house to fuck them there. Pretty ballsy. I don't understand that. Probably, I don't know, go with those dudes to their houses. Why are you bringing them back to fuck in the home where your husband, his parents, and his siblings are all staying? Although this infuriated Stefano's father-in-law, well, her father-in-law, his father, Barbara's husband, Stefano, did not mind her nightly escapades. In fact, he encouraged them. Was she married to a cuck who liked it when his wife fucked around him? We'll learn eventually here what the deal is here. And then Salvatore Vinci, that likely Sardinian rapist and murderer we met earlier, well, now he moves in with the Mele family as well. And Stefano was unbothered by the affair that now bloomed between the handsome Sardinian and his young wife. During the trial for Barbara's death, Salvatore would testify that Stefano wasn't jealous. He was the one who invited me to live in their house when I was looking for a place to live. Come live with us, he said. We got a free room. So I moved into Mele's house, and right away he brought me to meet his wife in bed. Then he urged me to take her to the movies. He said that it didn't matter to him, or he would go play cards at his social club and leave me alone with her in the house. So very different strokes for different folks. Definitely not my kink, but maybe it worked for Stefano. Again, eventually we'll learn what's going on here. At some point after Salvatore and Barbara's affair began, Stefano was severely injured in a vehicle collision. A car wreck kept him bedridden at the hospital for the next 4 months. And then the next year, Barbara gave birth to a boy named Natalino. Although she claimed her husband Stefano was the father, it was obvious to anyone with the ability to count to 9 that Natalino was conceived during the months Stefano was in the hospital, when the couple were definitely not fucking. When she was definitely fucking Salvatore. Therefore, the child could not be Stefano's. This again did not seem to bother Stefano. He appeared happy to raise the child as his own. While Salvatore was fine with the situation, his dad was not. And now he kicks his son Stefano, his wife Barbara, baby Natalino, and Barbara's boyfriend Salvatore the fuck out of his house. Stefano and Barbara now stay together and move to a working-class suburb just outside of Florence. Barbara continues to see Salvatore until the summer of 1968 when she dumps him for his macho brother Francesco. So, one night that summer, Barbara wore a new dress to go meet up with Francesco and his friends at a bar. When she arrived, Francesco thought her dress was too, quote, slutty and punished her for it. He pushed Barbara down onto the floor of the bar in front of everyone else there, grabbed a fistful of her hair, literally dragged her out of the bar, kicking and screaming, out into the middle of the street where he ripped off her dress, kicked some dirt in her face, called her a whore. No one stopped him. No one intervened, which tells me this bar was full of other dudes who also had no respect for women, or that Francesco was a scary motherfucker, or both. Not surprisingly, the affair between these two fizzled out soon after this assault. Jumping ahead a few years now to August of 1968, when Barbara met Antonio Lobianco, he was a muscular bricklayer from Sicily, and like Barbara, he was married. Reportedly, when he first saw Barbara and was told her name, Antonio claimed, "Barbara, I'll fuck her in a week." So Barbara clearly loved a classy guy. He did fuck her in a week, and then on August 21st, 1968, Antonio, Barbara, and Barbara's 6-year-old son now, Natalino, went to see a Japanese horror movie at the movie theater. Afterwards, they all piled into Antonio's car, drove into the Florentine countryside to find a good spot to fuck. Natalino, not part of the fucking, thank God, to be clear. Only Antonio and Barbara were fucking. And Barbara was a terrible mother, right? Can we agree on that based on just this one date? And can we also agree that Antonio was a fucking dirtbag? I mean, who for starters takes their 6-year-old to a Japanese horror movie? Like 6 years old? That seems like a terrible idea. And then on the way home, they're just going to fuck in the same car inches away from this kid. My God, the night, this night was fucking this kid up even before his mom got killed. Well, these two decide to park at a location they frequented often for some good old backseat deep dicking, a secluded dirt road near an old and rarely visited graveyard. So it just keeps getting better. The couple started having sex in the driver's seat, Barbara straddling Antonio cowgirl style, which means she would have been able to watch her kid while she fucked this guy, her kid who for sure was awake. Then in an instant, the interior of the car lit up in flashes of bright yellow. The killer had silently approached the vehicle from behind, positioned himself just outside the back left car door. They then steadily reached inside an open backseat window, holding the gun mere inches above the child's head, and fired 7 shots in rapid succession with a .22 Beretta, 4 into Antonio and 3 into Barbara. The 6-year-old now began, of course, to scream for help. Then someone opened the car door, likely the shooter, scooped up little Natalino, hoisted the child onto their shoulders, and started singing a lullaby to calm them down. It was Natalino's father, Stefano Mele. He was holding a gun. Did not expect that plot twist at all when I first went through this. Did this cuck get tired of his wife getting fucked by other men? A few hours later, Stefano Mele picked up by the police, taken in for questioning. At first, he told investigators that he was sick and had been home by himself all night. But after traces of nitrate powder were found on his hand, Stefano broke down, confessed that while he had witnessed the murder of his wife, he didn't kill her himself. He said that Salvatore Vinci killed his wife, and Antonio, and that he had just gone along with it. Doesn't explain the nitrate powder, but, interesting. Salvatore, likely, the young boy who was in the backseat, Natalino's real father, or biological father, rather. Seemingly overcome with regret, Stefano then soon retracted his accusation against Salvatore, instead took full responsibility for the crime, saying he alone acted and executed the double homicide. But then a few hours later, doubled back again, asserts once more that Salvatore killed Barbara and Antonio. That back and forth confession befuddled investigators, so they decided to bring Salvatore in to see how Stefano and he would interact. The exchange that took place, according to those present, was pretty remarkable. When Salvatore Vinci arrived at the police station, he calmly marched into the interrogation room, exuding an air of authority. Inside, he stood silently before Stefano, staring coldly at the small man, and when Stefano finally met Salvatore's eyes, he apparently immediately crumbled to the ground, began to sob, and repeat, "Forgive me, please forgive me," over and over again, very afraid of this guy. Stefano, just a sad little mouse of a man. When Salvatore departed the station, Stefano once again insisted that he was the sole perpetrator now of the double homicide. However, investigators were already uncovering other clues that more than one person may have been involved in this double homicide. For example, while being questioned, young Natalino told police straight up that he saw Salvatore, that dirty shrub slut, lurking in the bushes by the car. also described a shadow of another man at the crime scene and said he saw someone he referred to as Uncle Piero or Uncle Pietro, a man he knew who parted his hair on the right and worked at night. Who is that guy? Well, they don't look into it. Natalino's testimony largely ignored. Investigators were reportedly irritated with the child's incoherence and confusion, so much so that at one point, one awesome officer said to the boy, "If you don't tell the truth, I'll take you back to your dead mother." So that guy's pretty cool. In the end, the authorities ignored the child's testimony, other indications that there had been multiple perpetrators, and just focused on Stefano. According to author Douglas Preston, at this point, the police and the examining magistrate, the judge who oversees the investigation, felt satisfied. Regardless of the particulars, the crime was solved in the main. They had the confession of the wronged husband, backed by forensic evidence and the statements of the son. Stefano Mele was the only one charged with murder. He was given a reduced sentence of 14 years, and with that, the case was closed. Or at least investigators thought it was. But soon after Stefano was released from prison, 13 years later, in 1981, his guilty verdict will be put into question and the case will be reopened. Backing up from 1981, though, to 1974 now. On the night of September 14th, 1974, so about 6 years after that double homicide we just went over, there is another double homicide. 18-year-old Stefania Patini and 19-year-old Pasquale Gentilcore are murdered while having sex in Pasquale's car. The couple had spent the earlier part of that fateful Saturday night in a discotheque called Teen Club in Borgo San Lorenzo, a rural municipality on the outskirts of Florence. After the club, they drove Pasquale's Fiat 127 to find a secluded spot to fuck in the countryside. They were engaged to be married in just 2 weeks, but of course they would never see their wedding day. They were both shot and killed in the act of having sex. And then their killer or killers dragged the naked Stefania out of the vehicle and stabbed her 97 times. She was already dead for all those wounds. He used knife wounds to create an elaborate intentional design that encircled both her breasts and her vagina. The killer then took an old sharp branch from a grapevine, repeatedly penetrated her corpse with it. Interestingly, the day before she was murdered, Stefania had confided in multiple friends that a strange man had been following her all week. She was terrified of him. One of her friends even told police that she had recently seen and talked to the strange man. A few days earlier, she said that he had showed up to take a driving lesson. She and Stefania were taking together, or showed up to a driving lesson she and Stefania were taking together, and tried to talk to them. But the police doesn't seem ever figured out who this dude was. Didn't seem like they really put any effort in trying to track him down. And now let's check in with one of the authors of The Monster of Florence, who gets swept up into this story now, Mario Spezzi. On the quiet Sunday morning of June 7th, 1981, 36-year-old Mario Spezzi was dying of boredom at work. He was a journalist for Florence's local newspaper, La Nazione, and that particular Sunday, it seemed that there was absolutely nothing remotely interesting happening in all of Italy to write about. So instead of working, Spezzi was sitting at his desk, smoking a cigarette, reading the paper. His piece was then soon interrupted when a coworker who covered the crime desk approached him and asked for a favor. He explained to Spezzi that he had a date with a not bad-looking married woman that morning and was hoping Spezzi could cover the crime desk in his absence. What the fuck is happening in Italy in the 70s and 80s? Does anyone there just have like a monogamous traditional sex life? Is it just the most sex-crazed nation on earth? It might be. I looked into a lot of studies about infidelity in Italy, and it seems that somewhere between 55 and 75% of Italian men cheat on their spouses. And between 35 and 50% of women have affairs as well. And I imagine those numbers were higher in the 1970s and 80s, but I can't prove it. Also found a bunch of blogs on Italian culture where the bloggers just kind of matter-of-factly state that, that's just how it is. It's just different there. Having lovers outside your marriage, very much a cultural norm. Also, I love that writer doesn't even describe the lady he's hooking up with as attractive. Can't even do her that kindness. She's not bad looking. She'll do. Just some not bad looking married lady that, he's just excited to go fuck. She is not so beautiful, but that's not a matter. His eyes are going to get my dick wet. Here we go. Just always got to fuck. All Spezzi would have to do, this guy explained, was hang around the police headquarters in case something came up. I've already made the calls. Nothing's going on. As we all know, nothing ever happens in Florence on a Sunday morning. But then, of course, something did happen. Something terrible. When Spezzi arrived at the police station, the place was in chaos. By eavesdropping on all the frantic commotion, the journalist deduced that a crime had taken place near Villa del Arrigo, a well-known estate in the Florentine hills, and that at the scene that there were two of them. He didn't know yet what two of them meant. Less than an hour later, Spezzi was driving along a small country road searching for signs of a crime scene. Eventually, he spotted a squad car, The squad car of a local carabinieri marshal pulled over next to it. The carabinieri are a major national law enforcement agency in Italy that is part of the military. The first thing Spezzi noticed was that the crime scene had not been sealed off or secured. There was also only one cop present who allowed Spezzi to enter the area freely. Had no concerns about crime scene contamination. So that's awesome. At the direction of the officers, Spezzi followed a tiny dirt path into an olive grove. There he saw a parked car with a man slouched in the front seat. They're just not even guarding these dead bodies at all. The boy seemed to be sleeping in the driver's seat, wrote Spezzi. His head leaning on the side window, eyes closed, face smooth and untroubled. Only a little black mark on his temple, which lined up with a hole in the spider-webbed window indicated a crime had occurred. Spezzi circled the car, contaminating the crime scene further, not that the one cop at the scene of this double murder seemed to mind, and found a woman's naked corpse displayed flat on her back in a patch of flowers. No one had even thrown a blanket over her. Her pubic area had been carved out of her body, and there was no sign of where it had disappeared to. In the first double homicide in 1968, right, the woman is just shot and left in the car. In the second, in 1974, the woman is shot, dragged out of the car, violated with a grapevine, stabbed 97 times around her breast and vaginal area. And now in this double homicide, the woman is shot, dragged out of the car, and her vaginal area is carved the fuck out. When Spezzi commented on this horrifying mutilation, the officer present told him that some animals must have come in the night and eaten the flesh between the victim's legs. Skin, muscle, organ, and all. And then he told Spezzi, the hot sun did the rest. Oh, wow. Holy shit. How dumb is this cop? What fucking animal only eats a woman's vagina? Not eats out, just literally eats, but then doesn't eat any of the rest of her. And since when does the sun help destroy a corpse's vagina, but not affect the rest of her? What is happening? It's probably be a raccoon or maybe a squirrel. The squirrels around here, they're well known for a taste of liking the taste of a vagina. It's why we call them the pussy squirrels. Yes, the pussy squirrels, they did a number on her, Ciao Bella, Mario Luigi, Tuscan and Gnocchi, Sofia Lamborghini, Antonio Banderas. I picture this guy saying all that shit and then just shrugging his shoulders like, life, you know, it's a crazy. He just goes back to puffing a long, thin cigarette, not caring about the crime scene, just daydreaming about fucking somebody's wife that night in some other part of the woods. Back at the police station, Spezzi learned that the female victim was Carmela Denuccio, a 21-year-old aspiring designer working for Gucci right there in Florence. The male victim was her fiancé, Giovanni Faggi, 30 years older, a trusted local electrician. They'd been engaged to be married later that summer. Thanks to Spezzi's investigative reporting, La Nazione will be the first publication to break the news of the killings to Florence. Early the next morning, Spezzi went to meet Dr. Mauro Mari, the chief medical examiner assigned to the double homicide. Mari also happened to be one of Spezzi's closest friends. With a tape recorder on the table and a lit cigarette in hand, Mari told the journalist what he learned about the victims. It's the pussy squirrels, they got another pussy from a lady. What do you do? It's a life, it's crazy. No, he said the killer used a knife or some other sharp instrument. The instrument had a notch or a tooth in the mild, perhaps a defect, perhaps not. It might have been certain type of knife that takes that form. So he says there's notch in the knife. Seems to me, although I won't swear to it, that it was a scuba knife. 3 cuts were made to remove the organ. The first clockwise from 11 o'clock to 6 o'clock. The second was counterclockwise, again from 11 o'clock to 6 o'clock. The third cut was made from the top to bottom to detach the organ. 3 clean, decisive cuts with an extremely sharp edge. Like Jack the Ripper, replied Spezzi. And then Dr. Mari replied, no, not like him. Our killer is not a surgeon, not a butcher. Knowledge of anatomy was not required here. The investigators have been demanding to know, was the operation well done? Well, what does that mean, well done? Who has ever done an operation of this sort? Certainly it was done by someone with no hesitation, one who perhaps uses certain tools in his professional work. Wasn't the girl a leather worker for Gucci? Didn't she use a cobbler's knife? Wasn't her father also a leather worker? Perhaps it was someone in her orbit. It had to be someone with no mean ability with a knife, a hunter or a taxidermist, above all, a person with a determination and nerves of steel. Although he was working on a dead body, it was, after all, only just dead. Later that day, the entire staff of La Nazione met to discuss the new information Spezzi had received about the victims. Again, thanks to Spezzi's reporting, La Nazione was the only publication in all of Italy that knew about this mutilation. During the meeting, the young reporter suddenly asked if anyone remembered a very similar murder that took place in Borgo San Lorenzo, 1974, and everybody did. Spezzi, who had now officially been assigned to head all coverage on the case, quickly got to work writing an article comparing the recent murder of Giovanni Foggi and Carmela Danuccio to the 1974 murders of Stefania Patini and Pasquale Gentilcore. Tipped off by Spezzi's article, the police decided to start investigating the possibility that the killings had been committed by the same person. 2 days later, police announced that a ballistics test has revealed that the Giovanni Foggi, Carmela Danuccio, Stefani Patini, and Pasquale Gentilcore had been killed by the same gun, a .22 caliber Beretta long rifle handgun. The bullet shells collected from both the 1974 murders and the 1981 murders bore the same distinct mark on the rim of the cartridge. Right? Each gun's firing pin will leave on a microscopic level a signature of sorts, a fingerprint of sorts. And the same ballistics fingerprint had been left on bullet casings from both double murders, which meant one thing: a serial killer very likely loose in Florence. Right? Same weapon used. To track down the murder, the police first went to speak to some of those Indiani. Remember those shrub slut pervs? Those forest peepers, those hot, hard Italian father daddies, simply dripping in olive oil that they used to lube up their filthy Italian sausages. The prevalence of peeping toms in the Florentine hills well known at the station. And the investigators strongly believed that at least one of the pervs had to have witnessed something that night. Maybe an Indiano had even been watching Carmela and Giovanni have sex when they were killed. With minimal effort, they discovered that there had, of course, been an Indiano in the area when the crime took place. A local perv named Enzo Spalletti. Oh, Enzo. It's Enzo. That's a crazy guy. Look at what he doing again. When he wasn't creeping on strangers while they had sex, Enzo worked as an ambulance driver in Florence. That's cool. That's good that he had an important job. Entire town knew he was a voyeur. That's what the sources say. Including his wife, who Spezzi described as, quote, a fat, honest, simple country girl. For fuck's sake. What a rough description. Spezzi describes Spalletti as a... He doesn't hold back when he describes this guy either. He describes Enzo Spalletti as, quote, a small man with an enormous mustache, tight little eyes, a big nose, a chin that stuck out like a knob, and a small sphincter-like mouth. He looked like a man with something to hide. My God, Spezzi does not hold back when it comes to just brutally describing people. We needed to talk to the fat dumb country bumpkin's husband. The little beady-eyed rat of a man with the stinky butthole for a mouth. He's the guy we need to track down. When Spalletti was taken to police headquarters for questioning, though he admitted to being in the Florentine Hills the night of the murders, he vehemently and arrogantly denied spying on anyone. Mr. Peeping Tom Butthole Mouth claimed that that night he had picked up a prostitute from town and drove her into the woods to fuck. So that's cool. When he's not watching other people fuck in the woods, he's fucking in the woods himself. Was anyone in Florence in the 1970s or 80s not fucking in the woods? Interrogators pointed out that no sex worker would ever in a million years get into a stranger's car. What? Let alone allow that stranger to drive them 40 miles away into the middle of the woods. I'm pretty sure that's exactly what a lot of sex workers would do. But maybe that wasn't the norm in Florence. What do you mean not get into a stranger's car? After his alibi was questioned, Spalletti admitted that he had been spying on couples. After his alibi was, questioned and it didn't hold up, Spalletti admitted, he felt it didn't hold. Anyway, Spalletti admitted that he had been spying on couples in the area that night, so he was lying about the sex worker, and that he even parked his car not far away from where Carmela Danuccio and Giovanni Foggi had been murdered. He also admitted that he knew Carmela and Giovanni, or more accurately, knew of them. He had watched them fuck previously. He told interrogators that the couple's copper Fiat was known as a, quote, good car amongst the Indiani. And vantage points from where a voyeur could watch Carmela and Giovanni fuck, highly sought after. It's a primo fucking. Spalletti also said that night he had been watching a different couple. And despite how close his car was to the victims, he never saw anything. But the police didn't buy this. And so a few weeks later, Spalletti charged with being the monster of Florence. And the ambulance driver / voyeur is locked up in the Florentine prison of La Morate. While Florentines rejoiced that the murderer had been caught, journalist Mario Spezzi thought they had the wrong man. For months after Spalletti was convicted, Spezzi expressed his opinion to anyone who would listen. He wrote scathing criticisms of how poorly the investigation was being handled in newspaper articles and pointed out that the police had never found any direct evidence linking Spalletti to the crime. Then just 4 months later, October 21st, 1981, Spezzi's doubts are proven justified and Spalletti is proven innocent. On the night of October 21st, while Spalletti is incarcerated, the monster strikes again. A fourth couple is murdered in the woods outside of Florence. This time, he violently ended the lives of 26-year-old Stefano Baldi and his fiancée, 24-year-old Susanna Cambi. They were murdered in the same ritualistic way as the previous two couples. The night they died, Stefano and Susanna, had driven to a rural area nestled at the base of the Calavana Mountains. The couple parked their car on a dead-end dirt road between vineyards, started having sex in the front seat. When Spezzi arrived at the crime scene the next day, he was unsurprised to see that, again, no effort had been made to secure the area or preserve the evidence scattered around it. I feel like the first just order of business for an Italian police officer when they arrive at a crime scene, or at least when they did a few decades ago, was to set up a stereo system and just play the Benny fucking Hill theme, just on loop, just max volume. I feel like the Italian police department in Florence would just hire literally anyone in the 70s and 80s. You can be blind, deaf, just released from prison where you served 15 years for rape and murder, literally be flipping through pages of some homemade magazine of kiddie porn in the lobby of the police station, walk into your interview with a heroin needle stingling out of your arm, not be wearing any clothes at all from the waist down, just take a shit in the middle of the job interview on top of your desk. And then whoever is interviewing you and still immediately get hired. Just, you're the perfecto! You're gonna fit in right perfecto here. I take a shit on the desk in celebration and solidarity with you. Stefano and Susanna's bodies were more or less assembled in the same way as the previous victims. Stefano was dead in the driver's seat, his car door window shattered from the gunfire. The left car door Susanna had been dragged out of was still wide open. They found her body 10 meters from the car, splayed on the grass with her arms crossed over her exposed chest. Just like the previous murdered woman, her entire pelvic region had been carved out and removed. Medical examiner Mauro Mari informed investigators there was no evidence of rape or molestation, but that she'd been mutilated using the same notched knife as the others, the previous two female victims. How did he know that her vagina had been cut out? It's missing. How did anyone know if she'd been raped or not? I'm pretty sure you would need to find the vagina to make that determination. Also found at the site was a granite doorstop shaped like a truncated pyramid. The style of doorstop, very popular in old Tuscany country houses. Spezzi recognized it immediately. Remember this little doorstop detail. It's going to be important for some insanity coming up at the end of the episode. Or you know what? Don't even worry about it. I'll remind you. Additionally, the Winchester Series 8 shells collected from the site all bore the same distinct mark of the monster's gun. The day after these murders, Enzo Spalletti, the first and far from the last guy to be arrested for being the monster of Florence on zero evidence, is now released from prison. Over the course of the next month, Mario Spezzi writes 57 articles for La Nazione on the serial killer. And in one of the articles, he describes the killer as the monster of Florence, a moniker that will stick. During this period, Spezzi will later write, "The police and the Carabinieri were swamped with letters, anonymous and signed, which had to be followed up on. Doctors, surgeons, gynecologists, even priests were among those accused, along with fathers, son-in-laws, lovers, and rivals. Up to this time, Italians had considered serial killers a Northern European phenomenon, something that happened in England, Germany, or Scandinavia, and of course in America, where everything violent seemed to be magnified tenfold, but never in Italy. While individuals were concocting their own personal theories about why their ex-boyfriend or shitty boss or father-in-law had most definitely committed these homicides, the country as a whole also painting an elaborate picture of the serial killer. Public opinion began to gel around the portrait of the monster. He was a man of culture and breeding, upper class, and above all a surgeon. Hadn't the medical examiner stated that the operation performed on Carmela and Susanna had been done with great ability? Hadn't there been talk that the operation might have been done with a scalpel? And there was the cold-blooded and highly calculated nature of the crimes themselves, which hinted at a killer of intelligence and education. Inadvertently, Spezzi had helped fuel the biggest theory that the killer was someone who worked in the medical field, even though he himself did not believe that. More than anything else, perhaps, this belief was fueled by the unfortunate headline for an article about Stefano and Susanna he wrote, which read, "The Surgeon of Death is back." Though he was speaking metaphorically, the people of Italy largely took this literally, and doctors, nurses, vets, and especially gynecologists now became subjects of immense suspicion and just harassment. 8 months after the previous killings, June 19th, 1982, the monster of Florence strikes again. This time, he or they murdered 22-year-old Paolo Minardi and his girlfriend, 20-year-old Antonella Migliorini. It was the first Saturday of the summer. Paolo and Antonella had spent the earlier part of the evening hanging out with some friends at an ice cream kiosk in Piazza del Popolo. When Paolo first suggested that he and Antonella drive out to the countryside to get some alone time together, she refused, according to some of her friends. She was terrified about the monster of Florence, as were all young lovers at the time, and she didn't want to risk it. But eventually, unfortunately, she acquiesced and soon after found herself in the remote Chianti countryside just south of Florence near the castle of Papiano. They parked the car at the very end of a little dead-end road, so the front of it was facing the bushes. After she and Paolo finished having sex, Antonella hopped into the back to put her clothes back on. A reconstruction of the crime scene indicated that while this was happening, Paolo, who was sitting in the driver's seat, must have spotted the killer standing in the bushes in front of the car. Because terrified, he quickly shifted into reverse, slammed on the gas. The killer, unfortunately, was also quick and immediately started shooting into the windshield. Paolo was shot in the right shoulder. Antonella had flung her arms around his head. He managed to get, despite like all the shooting, despite getting shot, despite, kind of having his eyes covered by Antonella, he did manage to back out of the lane. Unfortunately, he continued in reverse well past the main road, and then the car slid backwards into a ditch on the other side and got stuck. And then the monster caught up with them. First coolly fired 2 shots from his Beretta and blew out each headlight, then fired 2 more shots, one into each of the victims' heads. He then yanked Paolo's dead body out of the driver's seat, attempted for quite some time to get the car out of the ditch. Eventually he gave up, departed the crime scene without cutting his usual trophy off of the female victim. So perhaps some other lovers came along and spooked him. Since half of Florence was fucked in the woods back then, perhaps he was just worried about the car being so close to a road. Prior to this fresh double homicide, a forensics team had constructed an identikit portrait, a composite sketch based on numerous witness descriptions of the possible killer, what the monster of Florence might look like. The police had initially opted to keep the portrait out of the public eye for fear of arousing hysteria, but after these 2 murders, they decided to release it. June 30th, 1982, the identikit rendering of the monster's face is published on the front page of every major newspaper in all of Italy. Overnight, tips about the killer's identity, which had been steadily coming in daily since the Bartolini Fields murders, increased tenfold. Everybody, it seemed, recognized his face. Men who shared vaguely similar features as a sketch were harassed in the streets, accosted by family members and friends, refused service at restaurants and grocery stores. The owner of a butcher shop near the Porta Romana of Florence had to close his store for a full week because a crowd of people holding up newspaper clippings of the identikit and screaming that he was the killer kept congregating at his fucking door. Italians. They truly have a loud, expressive, very lively culture. A lot of passion, a lot of heart, a lot of volume. So very different from my Nordic ancestors. I grew up largely around Swedish and Norwegian. You don't show much emotion even when someone dies energy. Italy has the opposite of that, it seems to me. My main memory of traveling to Italy for a week when I was 19 years old was wishing everyone would be quieter, stop waving their fucking hands around so wildly, and just kind of calm down in general. None of that hysteria surprises me in the least. Another man with a similar face also endured harassment, though he lost a lot more than just customers. This poor bastard worked at a pizza place, Red Pony Pizzeria, and the day the identikit was released, a group of middle schoolers, a bunch of boys, kept coming in, started to mock him, then they would pretend to run out of the store in terror, and that same night he was so upset by all that he cut his own throat. Amongst a mountain of batshit knee-jerk paranoid accusations, a single envelope did stand out to investigators. Inside, the sender had enclosed a clipping of an old La Nazione article about the double homicide of Antonio Lobianco and Barbara Locci in 1968. Scrawled haphazardly across the yellowed newspaper was, "Take another look at this crime." So they did, and investigators quickly discovered that the murder of Antonio and Barbara, which had taken place 14 years earlier, very similar to the current murders being committed by the so-called monster of Florence. Just like Pasquale and Stefania, Giovanni and Carmela, Stefano and Susanna, and most recently, Paolo and Antonella, Antonio and Barbara were having sex in a car in the Florentine hills when they were killed. Even more damning than that, just like the other victims, the killer shot Antonio and Barbara with a .22 Beretta, using Winchester Series H rounds. However, most investigators felt that despite the monster's name being written all over the 1968 murders, there was just no way the crimes could have been connected. After all, as we went over earlier in the timeline, Antonio and Barbara's murder had already been solved. Right? Stefano Mele, Barbara's husband, had confessed to and been found guilty of the murder of his wife and her lover. On top of that, Stefano could not possibly have gone on to be the monster of Florence, as he had been living in a mental institution for ex-convicts since his release from prison. I'm not totally surprised. He seemed like he needed some help. Still, some investigators would explore the connection further and ran a lab on the shells collected from the 1968 crime scene. And then shockingly, or perhaps unshockingly, depending on how you look at it, they found that each of the shells bore the same unique marking, that firing pin bullet casing signature of the monster. So the murders were connected. And now the police immediately go to interrogate Stefano Mele. But when they arrive at the small priest-run institution to question him, they're disappointed to find he is incomprehensible. Investigators leave empty-handed, and in their wake, dozens of journalists from all over the country flock to the same institution, hoping for an interview with Melee. The priest running the place, however, will not let that happen. He just is not mentally stable enough. He's gone mad. No one is allowed to enter the property, let alone permitted access to Melee. However, Mario motherfucking Spezzi will find a way to speak with him. Determined to his interview, Spezzi reached out to the priest, told them he was a filmmaker, that he wanted to make a documentary about all the good humanitarian work that they were doing. Flattered. This is pretty clever. Priest agreed to let Spezzi come by, shoot his doc. The journalist arrives the very next day with the cameraman. And after filming a very flattering interview with one of the priests and a few more with a couple of the other inmates to keep his ruse going, he is finally sitting face to face with Stefano Mele. And Spezzi describes Mele as feeble, nervous, and odd. He wrote, "To move a chair was almost a superhuman feat for him. An expressionless smile frozen on his face revealed a cemetery of rotten teeth." Oh my God. He was hardly the picture of the cold-blooded killer who 15 years before had murdered 2 people with deficiency and sang-froid. The interview at the beginning was difficult. Mele was on guard and suspicious, but little by little he relaxed and even began to warm up to the 2 filmmakers, glad to have finally found sympathetic listeners to whom he could confide. He finally invited them back to his room where he showed them old photographs of his missus, as he called his murdered wife, Barbara, Barbara, as well as pictures of their son, Natalino. When asked about the night Barbara and her lover were murdered, Mele immediately became incoherent and rambling and said nothing of any real value. But then right before Spezzi and the cameraman departed, Mele grabbed Spezzi's arm and said, "They need to figure out where the pistoli is. Otherwise, there will be more murders. They will continue to kill. They will continue." Spezzi now wondered, is it possible that Mele was not alone the night his wife and her lover were killed, like Spezzi himself originally confessed shortly after his arrest? And if so, is it also possible that whoever his accomplice was, or his accomplices were, that they went on to become the monster of Florence? During his trial, Mele told investigators that he threw a gun he used to shoot the 2 victims into a nearby ditch, but that gun was never found. If that gun could be found, it would likely lead to capturing the monster of Florence, people thought. Now this became the primary focus of the investigation. Where was that Beretta? A famous and long-running stage of the investigation known as the Pisa Sarda, aka the Sardinian Trail, now began. Would they be able to crack the Barbagian code and get any of the Sardinians to rat out one of their own, give up somebody they might think of as a Balente? As investigators dove deeper into who Stefano's potential accomplices were, they honed in on Salvatore Pince and Vinci, and Francesco Vinci, his brother, both of whom, like Stefano, hailed from Sardinia, and both of whom also had affairs with his wife, Barbara. Of the 2 brothers, Francisco seemed like the real obvious choice. He was the real Balente of the 2, an outlaw who had a history of assault, stealing, was known to beat up his girlfriends. But never really get arrested for that. This dude was hanging out with a real cool crowd. The investigators collected circumstantial evidence placing Francesco at or around each of the double homicides. And on August 17th, 1982, Francesco Vinci is arrested for being the monster of Florence. But again, not everybody convinced the right man is behind bars. Francesco was from a poor backwoods part of the country. He was brutish, cheap, rough around the edges, did not fit the portrait of the monster Florentines had concocted in their heads. Some hyper-intelligent man from high society, a surgeon, some aristocrat. Mario Spezzi, for one, absolutely sure Francesco was innocent, and wrote article after article proclaiming so. In addition to the fact that there was no hard evidence against him, Spezzi wrote frequently about the fact that Francesco, being the monster of Florence, simply made no sense to him. On the evening of September 10th, 1983, Spezzi is having dinner with a young filmmaker named Cinzia Torini to discuss the possibility of making a film about the monster of Florence. During their meal, Torini asked Spezzi if he still thought Francesco was innocent. After all, there had been no killing since the Sardinian had been put behind bars a little over a year ago. According to his later book, Spezzi responded, "All the police have against Francesco is that he was a lover of the first woman killed, that he beats up his girlfriends, and that he's a crook. In my view, these are elements in his favor. Francesco likes women. He's a big success with women, and that's enough to convince me he is not the monster. He hits them, but he does not kill them. The monster destroys women. He hates them because he wants them and can't have them. That's his frustration, the thing that damns him. And so he possesses them physically in the only way he can, which is to steal the part most indicative of their femininity." When Spezzi first said that Francesco likes women but beats them up, I wasn't in favor of his argument. But the part about wanting them but not being able to have them, that's not a bad argument. However, there have been plenty of guys like Ted Bundy and serial killer we just recently covered, Randy Woodfield, who did get plenty of attention from women but still killed them sometimes. Anyway, Torini then asked Spezzi, what he thought about the ritualistic aspect of the killings and the theory that the monster killed couples having premarital sex to punish them. Specifically, she was referencing the conspiracy theory that the monster had penetrated Stefania Pettini in 1974 with the grapevine branch because of the Bible verse that says, every branch in me that beareth not fruit, he taketh away. In other words, the conspiracy theory was that the monster was punishing Stefania and other female victims for having sex for non-procreative purposes, aka not to bear fruit. Spezzi responded, hilariously in my opinion, "That's a bunch of twaddle. You know why he used an old piece of grapevine? If you look at the crime scene photos, you see that they were parked right next to a vineyard. He simply grabbed the closest stick he could find. To me, his use of a stick to violate women seems to confirm that he is not exactly Superman. He didn't and probably can't rape his victims." So impotence, not a bad guess here. That's come up before in a lot of serial killer cases, right? They take out their rage over their impotence on their victims, violate them in ways they can't with their own dick. What is big deal? That is how Chikatilo do. While still discussing Francesco's possible innocence and logistics of making a movie about the monster of Florence, Spezzi now gets a phone call. It was one of the journalists' contacts at the police station, calling to tell him that 2 more bodies had just been discovered. This pair were murdered in Giogoli, a village in the Florentine countryside. Spezzi and Torini immediately get in his car, drive to the crime scene. Per usual, the scene had not been blocked off. Even better this time, it was very crowded. All kinds of evidence just being destroyed. The medical examiner, chief investigators team, other police officials, they're all there fucking roaming about, stomping on shit, surveying the scene. Prosecutors working on the case against Francesco, also present, looking irritated, disheartened. After all this fresh new killing proved that the man that they were trying to prove was the monster of Florence, certifiably not. Yeah, just fucking crazy. The center of the commotion was a Volkswagen camper bus with German license plates. Over all the chatter outside, Spezzi could hear the Blade Runner theme song emanating from inside the camper, and he learned that the 2 victims, Wilhelm Friedrich Horst Meyer and Jens U. Rusk, both 24 years old and both men, had been shot to death the previous night while watching Blade Runner, and that since their death, the recorder had been looping the movie over and over and over again. The 2 men were from West Germany, had been vacationing in Italy to celebrate Meyer's reception of some prestigious scholarship. Spezzi wondered why the monster would target 2 men this time, but soon found his answer when he entered the Volkswagen bus. Just walks in the fucking bus. This is an active crime scene. They have not collected all the evidence from. Just going wherever he wants. No one's stopping him. This is awesome. Inside, he finds Meyer's body splayed on the double mattress, his feet towards the rear of the van, his head just behind the driver's seat. In the very back of the van is a small crouched figure shrouded by long blonde hair, crown of his head covered in congealed blood. And at first, Spezzi thought that this corpse was a woman. However, it was in fact Jens Rusk. On the floor of the van, Spezzi saw a magazine had been ripped apart. The pages thrown about the floor. The name of the magazine was Golden Gay. The monster had shot Meyer through the window of the van, which they estimated placed him at least 5 foot 10 inches tall, so he could do that with proper aim. Then came inside, shot Rusk while he crouched in the corner, likely thinking he was a woman. The monster then realized the 2 men were gay lovers, and frustrated, ripped up the magazine and left. Despite this new double homicide, the police theorized that the monster of Florence was the member of some Sardinian clan, and that Francesco Vinci knew who it was. So despite this new evidence that he was innocent, the police refused to release Francesco from prison. Just 9 days later, on September 19th, 1983, current incarcerated monster of Florence prime suspect Francesco's nephew Antonio Vinci is arrested now for illegal possession of firearms. As a reminder, Antonio was the son of Salvatore Vinci and his wife Barbarina, who he had raped and gotten pregnant back in Sardinia. And though Barbarina's death had been ruled a suicide, many believe that Salvatore was responsible, and that before he ended her life, he removed the little baby Antonio from her side. Salvatore and his son were never close, even when Antonio lived with him on the mainland for some time. However, Antonio and his uncle Francesco, thick as thieves, literally. The 2 were known to hang out at the same Sardinian gangster hotspots and commit the same petty crimes together. So when Antonio was arrested for illegal possession of firearms, the police launched into action. They decided that both Francesco and his nephew knew who the monster of Florence was if one of those guys wasn't the monster themselves, and now both men were being held at La Marate prison in Florence, and investigators tried to pit them against one another. They told Francesco that Antonio confessed that he was the killer. They told Antonio the same, just vice versa. Despite this, both men remained cool and calm and maintained their innocence. Antonio even acted as his own lawyer and pointed out that the guns had not been found at his house but near it, and that there was no evidence they actually belonged to him. While Francesco remained incarcerated, Antonio was now promptly released. He's right. They couldn't prove anything. Determined to keep Francesco in prison, though, the examining magistrate himself, Mario Rotella, now goes to interrogate the mentally unstable Stefano Mele about who his accomplices were the night his wife and lover were murdered. Rotella, of course, was sure Mele was going to name Francesco, but Mele was no help. Over and over again, he just said that he'd forgotten what happened that night and who he was with, if anyone. However, Rotella did find something of value, a handwritten note tucked away in Mele's wallet. The note had been folded and unfolded over and over again, and on it was a list of talking points for Mele. It was written in a mix of Italian and Sardinian, and it was also riddled with spelling errors. Translated to English, the note basically says, it's pretty sloppy, report of Natalino regarding Uncle Pietro, that you would have said the name after serving the sentence. How was it shown from ballistic test if the shots were fired? Stefano Mele's brother, Giovanni Mele, had written the note 2 years prior when news of the Monster of Florence's connection to the 1968 murder of Mele's wife and lover broke. After days of studying the message and the old case files, Rotella realizes what Giovanni was trying to instruct his brother to do in this note. During the original investigation in 1968, Natalino, who had been in the car with his mom, Barbara, and her boy toy when they were murdered, kept saying that an Uncle Pietro, or Piero, had been at the scene of the crime. Investigators originally thought that Natalino was talking about his mom's brother, Pietro. However, Natalino's dad, Stefano Mele, also had a brother-in-law named Piero Musciorini. Rotella thought then that what the note was instructing Mele to do was to draw attention away from his sister's husband, Piero, and instead divert everyone's focus to deceased Barbara's brother, Pietro. Rotella took this to mean that both Giovanni Mele, Stefano's brother, and Piero Musciorini, Stefano's brother-in-law, must have both been Mele's accomplices in 1968 and then went on to commit the rest of the murders. It was just like a family affair. They're all in on it. So on January 24th, 1984, both Piero Musciorini and Giovanni Mele are arrested for being the monsters of Florence. The third and fourth men, now thrown behind bars for being the serial killer, based on nothing but just wild speculation, just no evidence. Yeah, fucking just throw them in there. If this logic seems hard to follow, join the club, Spezzi would write in yet another article on the murders. Hardly anyone except Mario Rotella pretends to understand this convoluted chain of deduction. Mario Rotella was the examining magistrate on the case. His role was to supervise not only the police, but the prosecutors and the public minister working under him as well. The public minister in the Monster of Florence case was a man named Piero Luigi Vigna. In Italy, the public minister of a case also serves as the lead prosecutor. And now after the arrest of Piero Musciorini and Giovanni Mele, tensions grow between the examining magistrate Rotella and his lead prosecutor Vigna. While Rotella was confident he had put the monster or monsters of Florence behind bars, Vigna and his team were certain the serial killer was still at large. During an interview, Rotella told Spezzi, "I can tell you one thing at least. Florentines can now rest easy." But that same day, one of the prosecutors working under Vigna told the journalist, "I would cordially invite young people to find some other way of maintaining their health than taking air of the countryside at night." Like how he said that. Not going to say that they're having sex, but you know what he means. Unfortunately, not all young couples heeded the warning, and while Stefano Mele, Francesco Vinci, Piero Musciorini, Giovanni Mele are all incarcerated in some form, the monster strikes again. July 29th, 1984. 21-year-old law student Claudio Stefanici, an 18-year-old bartender, Pia Gilda Rotini, now murdered while having sex in a car parked on a grassy patch of countryside outside the town of Vicchio, near Florence. Claudio, like the other male victims, shot in the head, his body still inside the car. Pia had been shot inside the car as well, then her body was dragged a few dozen meters from the vehicle. The killer, in his typical fashion now, cuts out her vagina and also rips off her left breast. Ripped off is how it's described in a few sources, but I think it was cut off. I fucking hope so. Both are barbaric. Ripping makes me feel less sick to my stomach than being cut. After the newest double homicide, the police and the newspaper are inundated with a fresh tidal wave of anonymous letters. Some letters accuse specific people of being the monster of Florence, include not only the accused names, but their address, phone number, place of work. Others are angry letters of advice telling the police how they should do their jobs. One letter read, "He is certainly a bachelor. Of about 40, he lives with his mother, who knows his secret, but his priest knows about it from confessions as he attends church regularly." Okay, it's kind of specific. Another said, "The monster is a woman, a genuine virago of British origin who teaches in a Florentine school where there are children up to 13 years of age." Sounds like whoever wrote that letter just doesn't like a certain teacher. It's hoping to somehow trick the police into arresting some random person they have a vendetta against. The master of Florence is my old master teacher, Mrs. Ferrari. That bitch who gave me an F, doesn't make her have to repeat the 6th grade. She's a monster. She has no soul. She hates everyone. She should burn the head. We should burn the witch. A lot of all this bullshit. One letter he received stuck out to Spezzi as potentially true. It was sent to his office at La Nazione, addressed to the monstrologer. It was handwritten and it read, this is so fucking creepy. I am very close to you. You will never take me away unless I choose it. The final number is still far away. 16 are too many. I don't hate anyone, but I have to do it if I want to live. Blood and tears will run soon. You will make no progress the way you are going. You have gotten everything wrong. Too bad for you. I will make no more mistakes, but the police will. Inside me, the night will last forever. I cried for them. Expect me. Because those last 3 sentences are especially creepy. Inside me, the night will last forever. I cried for them. Expect me. Ay, ay, ay. August 19th, 1984, Prince Roberto Corsini found dead in the vast forest that surrounds his family's estate. He had been shot in the face at point-blank range. The Corsini is one of Florence's oldest, most influential families. Despite investigators never giving any indication that this aristocrat was remotely involved in the monster case, rumors now began to spread that Prince Roberto was the monster of Florence and killed himself out of guilt. September 22nd, 1984. With no evidence connecting them to the crimes, no reason to keep them incarcerated, both Piero Mussolini and Giovanni Mele are released from prison. November 10th, 1984, Francesco Vinci also released from prison. So now no monster suspects are behind bars. Yeah, they have no evidence on these guys. Because Mario Spezzi had been so vocal about his innocence, Francesco invited the journalist to attend his welcome home party, and he did. At the end of the party, Francesco agreed to do an interview, during which Spezzi asked him what he imagined the real monster was like. And he said, he is very intelligent, someone who knows how to move at night in the hills, even with his eyes closed. One who knows how to use a knife much better than most, and who once upon a time experienced a very, very great disappointment. The same year, a special police unit is formed and dedicated to unmasking the serial killer, Squad Anti-Mostro, or SAM. The monster has now been active for 16 years, if you count that first 1968 double homicide, where the woman was not mutilated, crimes for which Stefano Mele went to prison for 13 years for. Or the monster has been active for 10 years if the first murders he committed were the 1974 double homicide, where the woman was stabbed 97 times but did not have her vagina removed from her body. Following year, the killer strikes again for the final known time. On the evening of September 7th, 1985, 25-year-old musician Jean-Michel oh my God, this is a fucking insane name. Caviccivilli, I think, and 36-year-old businesswoman Nadine Morio are shot and stabbed while camping in a small tent in Scopeti. Both victims were from Audincourt, France. For the first time, investigators finally actually secured the fucking crime scene. However, in the crowd of angry journalists begging to be granted access, one is allowed to take some notes and report back to the others what he has seen, and that journalist is Mario Spezzi. Later, SAM investigators are able to recreate the crime scene and deduce what happened to the 2 French tourists. Jean-Michel and Nadine had been, not surprisingly, having sex in their tents when the monster found them. He first let them know he was there by slicing the outermost layer of the tent with the tip of his knife. He did not, however, pierce the inside of the tent. The monster was positioned directly outside of the tent's entrance, and when the victims unzipped the tent to find the source of the noise he was making, they were both bombarded with a spray of bullets. Nadine was killed immediately. Jean-Michel, an avid sportsman, runner of the 100-meter dash, able to sprint away naked. However, he didn't get very far. The monster, someone who must have been capable of running pretty fast himself, reached Jean-Michel before he could escape to the main road and stabbed him in the back and stomach and then cut his throat. Yee! Monster then returned to the tent to cut out Nadine's vagina and also remove her left breast. Following Tuesday, a package arrives at the prosecutor's office. It's addressed to Silvia Della Monica, the only woman working on the case, and inside, wrapped in some tissue paper, is part of Nadine's left breast. God, how much did that fuck her week up? I can't ever unsee that. Although Francesco, Giovanni, Piero had all been released from prison, the examining magistrate, Mario Rotella, still certain the answer to who the monster case, or the answer to the monster case, lay within that circle of Sardinians. So he adjusted his focus to the last suspicious Sardinian left, Salvatore Vinci. In addition to exploring the supposed suicide of his wife, Barbarina, back in 1961, Investigators also started looking into Salvatore's life after he immigrated to Tuscany. The most striking thing they found was Salvatore's sexual tastes, which they found pretty untraditional. They tracked down Salvatore's ex-wife, Rosina, who he was married to briefly after leaving Sardinia. She told him that her husband frequently partook in orgies and forced her into threesomes. If she refused, Salvatore would beat her. Rosina also said it was worse when his son Antonio arrived from Sardinia, who was only 4 years old. I was afraid that he would witness some of these perverse doings with other couples. Rosina eventually had enough of Salvatore's abuse and sexual escapades and ran away with another man. This devastated her stepson Antonio, who had grown incredibly attached to her. Another one of Salvatore's girlfriends told police, "I can say to you that Salvatore was the man, the only man who fully satisfied me in terms of sex. He had strange ideas, but what of it? He liked to make love to me while a man did it to him from behind." The mysterious circumstances of his first wife's death, paired with his unusual sexual taste, was all the evidence investigators needed to prove he was the monster of Florence for sure. "We got that guy. He liked the fucking ladies and the pussies. I want to take a dig in the butt. Case closed. He is a monster for Florence. We celebrate our time so much now." Before arresting Salvatore, however, investigators decided to also briefly put Stefano Mele in jail for some ludicrous charges of obstruction of justice, because they wanted to get him to talk again. Shockingly, the examining magistrate, Mario Rotella, actually did get something out of Mele this time. The feeble man asserted again that Salvatore da Vinci was one of the accomplices of the 1968 murder of his wife, Barbara Locci, and her lover, Antonio Lobianco. Mele also revealed that the reason he protected Salvatore for so long was because Salvatore knew Mele's deepest, darkest secret, that he was gay. Bingo! Did you see that coming? I actually did not when I first went over all this. Now I understand why he let his wife fuck dudes in his mom and dad's house. Probably angry that his parents, or I guess he's just his dad at that point, dad wouldn't accept him for being gay. Maybe it's just fun for him to fuck with a fam like that. And she was his beard. Mele stated that if he confessed that Salvatore was involved in the murder, Salvatore was going to reveal to everyone that Mele was a homosexual. And that was how Salvatore was able to control Mele for so long. He was willing to go to jail for 14 fucking years just to make sure no one found out he was gay. How sad, but in such a heavily Roman Catholic nation, back when the Catholic Church was aggressively homophobic, I guess I'm not totally surprised. While according to several studies, somewhere between 67% and 80% of the nation identifies as being Catholic now, I would guess that, back in the 60s, 70s, 80s, the numbers were even higher. At the end of 1985, Mario Rotelli now served Salvatore Vinci with an avisio, a notice that he was an official suspect for the 16 homicides committed between 1968 and 1985, just all of them. Then the following summer, June 11th, 1986, Mario Rotella orders the arrest of Salvatore Vinci, not for being the monster of Florence, but for the murder of his wife, Barbarina, whose death in 1961 was originally ruled a suicide. Rotella's decision to arrest Salvatore for a crime he may have committed 25 years earlier was strategic. If he was able to prove that Salvatore murdered his wife all those years ago, it would then be easier to prove he also went on to become the monster of Florence. On April 12, 1988, the trial of Salvatore Vinci begins in Cagliari, the capital of Sardinia. Mario Spezzi covers the trial for La Nazione. Salvatore's son, now 27-year-old Antonio, was brought in to testify against his father. At the time, Antonio was also serving time for an unrelated offense and had to be brought into the courtroom in handcuffs. And Antonio refused to speak. He sat, just silently stared daggers at his father. He later told Spezzi that if the officers hadn't been there, he would have leapt across the courtroom and strangled his father to death. It's a little anger there. Much to Mario Rotella's dismay, 5 days after the trial begins, April 17th, 1988, Salvatore Vinci is acquitted. The crime had taken place too long ago. All the witnesses had either died or could not remember significant details. After he was acquitted, Salvatore Vinci went to visit his birthplace in the interior mountains of Sardinia and was never seen in Florence again. August 2nd, 1989. FBI now creates a psychological profile for the monster of Florence, getting some help from America. Based on their analysis, the FBI stated that the killer was most likely some lowly Melvin, continually getting dick, wrist, and skull mogged in the hills that surround Florence when he tried to mind his own business and watch teenage couples fuck while beating his tiny little shrimp peen in the bushes. The FBI thought the killer was most likely an impotent male that harbored a pathological hatred of women and sought to punish them for his inability to perform. The FBI also stated that the monster of Florence was in all likelihood a loner, and that he mutilated women as a way to satiate his deviant sexual desires. Part of the report read, translated back into English from Italian, the aggressor in all likelihood effectuated a surveillance of the victims until they engaged in some form of sexual activity. It is at this point that the aggressor chose to strike, with the advantage of surprise, speed, and the use of a weapon able to incapacitate immediately. This particular approach is generally indicative of an aggressor who has doubts about his own ability to control his victims, who feels himself insufficiently prepared to interact with his victims alive, or who feels himself incapable of confronting them directly. The aggressor, using a sudden approach, discharged his weapon at close range, concentrating his fire first on the male victim, neutralizing in this way the greater danger to himself. Once the male victim is neutralized, the aggressor feels himself sufficiently secure to perpetrate his attack on the female victim. The use of many rounds indicates that the aggressor wanted to assure himself that both victims were deceased before initiating the mutilation post-mortem on the female victim. This is the real objective of the aggressor. The man represents only an obstacle that must be removed. The FBI profile also stated that the monster of Florence was not a rapist, nor was he someone that had a history of violent crimes. He may have a rap sheet with petty crimes, but nothing serious or overly alarming. Some other parts of the very long report read, the aggressor is a person who is inadequate and immature in sexual matters, who has had little sexual contact with women in his own peer group. The aggressor is best described as a person of average intelligence. He would have completed his secondary studies or the equivalent in the Italian education system. He would be experienced in work that required use of his hands. As for how and why the monster kills and maims its victims, the FBI profile said that the possession and the ritual are very important for this kind of aggressor. This would explain why the female victims are generally moved some meters from the vehicle containing their companion. The necessity of possession as a ritual enacted by the aggressor betrayed rage towards women in general. The mutilation of the sexual organs of the victims represent either the inadequateness of the aggressor or his resentment of the women. Despite how valuable and constructive the FBI's psychological profile appeared to be, the task force, SAM, refused to use it in their investigation. Why wouldn't they use it? Well, they chose not to use it because the FBI's description of the monster of Florence didn't sound at all like the investigators' newest suspect, a peasant farmer named Pietro Pacciani. So rather than allow their authority to be challenged, investigators not only ignored the FBI report, they suppressed it. So that's cool. I'm sure whatever FBI profilers, took time to put that report together were very happy about all that. Earlier that year, Sam had been taken over by a new chief inspector of police, a man named Ruggero Perugini. Unlike Mario Rotella, Chief Inspector Perugini was under the impression that the monster's gun, though originating from within the Sardinian clan during the 1968 murder of Bartolocci and Antonio Lobianco, had somehow been passed outside of the circle of Sardinians, and that continuing to look into the likes of Salvatore Vinci, Francesco Vinci, and Stefano Mele was useless. That is ludicrous. This high-ranking law enforcement official thinks that the murder weapon from the first double homicide somehow ends up in the possession of a guy who now just thinks, you know what? I'm also just going to start committing double homicides. I'm also going to target young couples in cars who are fucking in the woods, right? Why not? I have this gun now. And the previous dude who had this gun, he did that, so I should probably do it as well. Like, does Chief Inspector Perugini just think that the gun itself is pushing the guys to do this? Does he think it's possessed or cursed? He might actually. Perugini started searching for every man between the ages of 30 and 60 in Florence who had ever been picked up by police in a new Italian criminal computer database. So that part's good. Then filtered the long list down to those convicted of sexual crimes. Then filtered it further down to those who were in prison the years the monster was not active and out of prison when the monster was. Then he asked the computer to identify each of these men who lived in or around the areas that the monster had killed. And by the time he was done, the only name that remained that fit all the criteria was Pietro Pacciani. Investigators had previously been nudged towards Pietro back on September 11th, 1985, when they received an anonymous letter advising them to question our fellow citizen Pietro Pacciani, born in Vicchio. In this way, author Douglas Preston wrote, the most advanced system of criminal investigation, the computer, was married to the most ancient system, the anonymous letter, both of which fingered the same man. Looking deeper into Pacciani's past, Chief Inspector Perugini found that right after the monster's last killing in 1985, the peasant farmer had been sent to prison for raping his daughters. So he is a piece of shit. Chief Inspector Perugini took this as evidence that Pacciani was the monster of Florence, so that it explained why there hadn't been killings since. That's a weird rationale. He raped his daughter, so he must also shoot couples fucking in cars. And he must also cut women's vaginas out sometimes. Perugini also discovered that in 1951, Pacciani had been convicted of murdering his girlfriend's lover. Okay, that's more in line with the monster of Florence's crimes. Back in 51, Pacciani had discovered that his girlfriend was having car sex with some other dude in the woods, as one does in Florence. Furious, the peasant farmer ambushed the two of them, beat the man's head in with a rock, and stabbed him in the stomach. Then yanked his girlfriend out of the car and raped her right next to this guy's corpse. Holy shit. Although this might sound like the work of the monster of Florence, it was actually the opposite. Pacciani was uncalculated, messy, acted spontaneously, didn't kill the girl, didn't use a gun. His crimes were so poorly and impulsively executed that the police picked him up almost immediately. Still, Chief Inspector Perugini saw this as evidence that Pacciani went on to become the monster of Florence. What really sealed the deal for him was that when Pacciani was first taken into police custody after the murder, he told them he did it because he had seen his girlfriend expose her left breast to the man. And the monster, if you remember, right, had removed the left breast of 2 female victims. With enough evidence to be suspicious of the peasant farmer, Chief Inspector Perugini now orders investigators to search Pietro Pacciani's home and surrounding property. Let's just fucking go! Get in there! Run around! Stomp on stuff! Throw things around! Some of the incriminating evidence found at Pacciani's house was a single round from a hunting rifle. You know, he has a bullet in his house, and this guy had bullets at the crime scene. So, same guy. 2 World War II shell casings, one of which was being used for a flower vase. 5 knives, none of which matched the kind of knife used in the killings. Crude drawing in a sketchbook of an unidentifiable road. People were killed by roads. And a picture of Pacciani as a teenager holding a machine gun. How the fuck is that evidence? Investigators also discovered a reproduction of Botticelli's Primavera, in which a pagan nymph is depicted with flowers spilling out of her mouth. And that reminded Perugini of how one of the monster's first female victims was found with her necklace, kind of hanging around her mouth. So that's hardcore evidence. The most damning piece of evidence investigators found was a painting hanging in Pacciani's house that they found to be very disturbing. It was a strange centaur-ish creature endowed with both female and male sex organs. My God, arrest him at once! In the background, the painting displayed a green snake wearing a hat. 7 little crosses. In the corner of the painting, the artist assigned his name, Pietro Pacciani. Perugini immediately took the painting to be representative of the monster's sexual deviancy, and the 7 crosses indicative of the 7 double homicides committed. Perugini not counting the 1968 double homicide, when he refers here to 7 double homicides between 1974 and 85. Some crackpot psychologists he found later confirmed that this painting indeed was compatible with the psychopathic personality of the monster. All this evidence seemed to solidify that Pietro Pacciani was most definitely the monster of Florence, but it wasn't quite enough to arrest him yet. There was still another major issue. If Pacciani was a serial killer, how the fuck did the gun used in the 1968 Sardinian clan killing and 8th double homicide end up in his hands? Chief Inspector Perugini dealt with this issue in the simplest way possible. He accused Pacciani of also committing the 1968 murders. Now, fuck it, he did it all. Stefano Mele served 13 years in prison for nothing. However, examining magistrate Mario Rotella refused to allow Perugini to accuse Pacciani of the 1968 double homicide without any evidence at all. Unfortunately for Rotella, he was not well liked. He was deeply unpopular with both the press and the public, with coworkers. Very good at his job, but who cares about that? He wasn't fun. He was logical and not superstitious. He was a fucking party pooper. And that, along with his failed investigation into Salvatore Vinci, persuaded some of the higher-ups to side with Perugini instead of him and allow a man to be arrested for 8 double murders, despite literally having no evidence. Rotella was forced to close all his files, remove himself from the Monster of Florence case, as well as write a report clearing all the Sardinians from any involvement in the monster killings. Spezzi then wrote Spezzi, the author, now wrote that Rotella's final report was over 100 pages of logical exposition, and that, quote, it laid out the case against the Sardinians, it detailed the clan killing of 1968, how it was executed, who was involved, it traced the probable arc of the 22 Beretta from Holland to Sardinia to Tuscany, placed it in Salvatore Vinci's hands, it built a persuasive case that the Sardinians who participated in the 1968 killings knew who took the gun home and therefore did know the identity of the Monster of Florence, and that person was Salvatore Vinci. And then abruptly, on the last page, he wrote, for these reasons, this investigation shall proceed no further. I like that this investigator did write out this report as a fuck you to his higher-ups. 100 pages presenting real evidence that Salvatore Vinci was very likely the real killer, not Pietro Pacciani, followed by one sentence that basically said, if you read the subtext, But because my bosses are fucking dipshits, even though Salvatore definitely did it, an investigation into him is over. Jumping ahead a couple years now to 1992. By 1992, Chief Inspector Perugini still had not gathered enough evidence to arrest Pietro Pacciani for being the monster of Florence, but still thought he did it. Desperate, the chief inspector ordered another search of the peasant farmer's miserable home, he called it miserable home, and property, despite still having no evidence he was behind the murders again. From 9:50 a.m. on April 27th to noon, May 8th, an armed squad of elite investigators, can use the word elite loosely, conducted the longest, most technologically advanced property search in Italian history. Looked like they weren't going to find shit until 5:56 p.m., April 29th, when Chief Inspector Perugini, quote, discovered something he thought was groundbreaking. He later described this moment in his book, A Normal Enough Man, saying, I caught in the light of the late afternoon an almost imperceptible gleam in the earth. On the ground of Pacciani's dying garden where Winchester Series 8 was a Winchester Series H cartridge. It had not been fired, so it didn't have the monster's signature mark, but it had been inserted into a gun before. A ballistics team now runs an analysis on the cartridge, and the experts determine it was not compatible with being inserted into the monster's gun. Wrong fucking gun. However, Perugini didn't give a shit about that. He didn't care about analysis. Much like he didn't give a shit about the mountain of evidence, that clearly indicated Pacciani of other pieces of evidence. He was not the killer. So on January 16th, 1993, despite the ballistics tests actually not being good evidence and actually being evidence that he wasn't the guy, Pietro Pacciani is arrested for being the monster of Florence. And the confusing logic or lack thereof of Italian law enforcement continues. This is the seventh guy they've put behind bars for being the monster of Florence with fucking no evidence. Eighth, if you count Stefano Mele, serving 13 years in prison for the 1968 double homicide. At least there was a little evidence there with the nitrate powder in his hands. A few months later, April 14th, 1994, Pacciani's trial begins. Throughout the entirety of the proceedings, a peasant farmer sobs in a Tuscan dialect. I am a sweet little lamb. I'm a sweet little lamb. I'm here like a Christ on the cross. He just keeps saying that over and over again. Dude, you went to prison before for raping, your girlfriend after murdering her lover. And again, years later for raping your own daughters. So maybe you should shut the fuck up. You might not have committed these murders, but you're a long ways from being a sweet little lamb. 4 days into the trial, Spezzi now breaks a monumental piece of news. The journalist discovered that the primary piece of evidence against Pacciani, I love that this is the primary piece of evidence, the bizarre painting of the centaur that he supposedly drew himself, was actually not done by him. It was actually done by a 50-year-old Chilean artist named Christian Olivares. So all he was guilty of was just taking credit for somebody else's work. How the fuck was that painting ever evidence in the first place? Spezzi reached out to Olivares to confirm this, and the artist told him, yeah, it was my work. And he was horrified his work was being used to confirm that somebody was a serial killer. He told Spezzi, in this painting, I wanted to present the grotesque horror of dictatorship. To say it is the work of a psychopath is ridiculous. It would be like saying the disaster of war by Goya indicated he was a madman, a monster who needed to be locked up. It is ridiculous to say that this is the work of a psychopath. Perugini is a ridiculous man. Chief Inspector Perugini responds to this news by claiming that the painting, actually on second thought, isn't the most important piece of evidence, even though it for sure was. And this shit show sham of a trial continues for 6 months. At one point, Pacciani's daughters, one of whom had become a nun, brought in to testify against him. On the stand, they describe in horrifying detail how their father raped them. However, neither daughter was able to recall a single thing that would implicate their father in the crimes committed by the monster of Florence. One witness brought forth by the prosecution was a dim-witted ex-postman from San Cassiano, one of Pacciani's friends, and truly known as the village idiot. It was clear to anyone who was also not an idiot that this poor guy didn't know what the fuck was going on. Bonnie responded to every question, including what is your name, by frantically babbling about how he didn't actually know Pacciani very well. He just kept repeating, we were picnicking friends. I guess like over and over, a preposterous amount of times. Inadvertently, with that phrase, and repeating it, he ends up throwing out a phrase that is still in the Italian lexicon today. The phrase picnicking friends, now used to refer to friends who pretend to do innocent things together when they're actually doing fucked up shit. Another witness was a man named Lorenzo Nessi, who Spezzi described as thin and smarmy. I love his descriptions. With slick back hair and Ray-Bans, shirt unbuttoned, gold chains dangling amongst his chest hair. A smooth talker and a small-time ladies' man. Whether it was for love of attention or the desire to be on the front page, Nessi would become a veritable serial witness, popping up when most needed, and suddenly recalling events buried for years. This was his debut appearance. There would be many more. On the witness stand, Nessie told the court that on the evening of September 8, 1985, the alleged night the two French tourists were killed. There's still a lot of debate on when that actually happened. He'd been driving home from a trip when construction forced him to take a detour. But he's full of shit. Construction on the highway he said he was traveling down actually had occurred the following weekend, not this weekend. There was no detour on the weekend of September 8th. But, prosecutor doesn't give a fuck. Still, Nessie claimed the detour took him past the Scapetti clearing where the French tourists were murdered. And on the road, he saw a rosy, reddish Ford Fiesta he was pretty sure was being driven by Pietro Pacciani. When the judge asked him why he didn't report that 10 years ago, Nessie said back then he wasn't sure of it, didn't want to report anything he wasn't 100% confident about. And the judge complimented Nessie for his, scrupulousness. Oh boy. Nessie's testimony was the nail in the coffin. On November 1st, 1994, Pacciani is now convicted of being the monster of Florence. Right? Case closed. He's a rapist. He's murdered before. He has a weird painting. A bullet casing that was for sure planted was found on this property that matched the type of bullets the killer used, even though it was definitely fired from a different gun. February of 1996, Mario Spezzi now meets Arturo Minoliti, the marshal of the Carabinieri, there we go, barracks of San Casciano. It has been almost 2 years since Pacciani was convicted, and since then, Spezzi has not stopped trying to prove this dirtbag peasant farmer's innocence. With this meeting, he finally hopes to accomplish just that. Marshal Minoliti had been present during the 12-day search of Pietro Pacciani's house in 1992 and was the only one there who wasn't connected with Sam or the police to witness the miraculous recovery of the Winchester Series H cartridge. Spezzi was sure the cartridge had been planted by someone on Chief Inspector Perugini's team, and he believed Minoliti was the man who would prove him right. When he arrived at the barracks, Minoliti welcomed Spezzi with open arms. Unbeknownst to the marshal, hidden in the journalist's oversized coat was a microphone and video camera. That must have been a fucking gigantic coat to hide those. They didn't have small video cameras back then. After a bit of congenial conversation, Spezzi finally asked Minoliti if he had any grave doubts about the investigation against Pacciani. With relief, the marshal immediately confided in Spezzi that there's only so many coincidences a man can abide by before getting suspicious, and during that search, there were so many coincidences. In regard to the smoking gun of the Winchester bullet, Minoliti told Spezzi that it really burned me the way that cartridge was found. I resented how Chief Inspector Perugini put us in such a difficult situation with the truth. We were in Pacciani's garden, I, Perugini, and 2 other agents on the squad. Those 2 were scraping the soles of their shoes on a cement grapevine post that lay on the ground and going on about the fact that they were both wearing the same shoes. At a certain moment, near the shoe of one of them, the base of the cartridge just appeared. But, Spezzi interrupted, Perugini described it quite differently in his book. Right, because he says the ray of light made the cartridge glisten. What ray of light? Look, maybe he just wanted to dress up the discovery a bit. And now Spezzi asked the big question, Minoliti, did they put it there? The marshal paused for a moment. Before responding, that's one hypothesis. More than a hypothesis even. I'm not saying I'm certain. I have to consider this against my will. It's a quasi-certainty. In light of the facts, I can't find any other explanation. After a bit more prodding, the marshal said, in light of reason, yes, I must say it was planted. I arrived at that conclusion that certain evidence is dirty. I am up against an extremely difficult situation. They've got my telephone tapped. I'm afraid. I'm truly afraid. The next day, Spezzi anxiously sits down on the couch to watch the news. His meeting with Minoliti was scheduled to air on the national television channel that had arranged the taping. Right, Ray, that evening. I wonder if you give Minoliti a little bit of a heads up. Hey, so Minoliti, I might want to watch the TV tonight. I secretly recorded our conversation yesterday, and they're going to air it. I am very sorry if this gets you killed. On top of this airing, 3 other national news channels had caught wind of the scoop and asked Spezzi for an interview about it. Those segments were scheduled to air that night as well, but no one airs it. Not the video, not the interview, nothing. Someone very powerful made sure of this, right? So much corruption. In the Italian judicial system, anyone convicted to a life sentence is granted an appeal. So on February 12, 1996, Pacciani appears before an appeals court with a new prosecutor, new panel of judges. Let's look at how corrupt all this shit is. The new prosecutor in charge of ensuring Pacciani's guilty conviction that it's maintained is Piero Toni. However, Toni, once he looks into the evidence or the lack thereof, he's so disgusted by the original trial that instead of truly prosecuting Pacciani, he spends his entire time in court criticizing the tragic investigation and picking apart every piece of so-called evidence against the peasant farmer. The fucking prosecutor is doing this. He is saying that Pacciani is innocent. This is a huge embarrassment to the original investigation, which is now under new leadership. That's fucking crazy. I don't think I've heard of something like that where the prosecutor's like, what? This guy? No fucking way. He's innocent, Your Honor. Prosecution rests. This is a bunch of bullshit. 6 months earlier, former Chief Inspector Perugini, that corrupt, idiotic fuck, was promoted to work as a liaison at the American consulate in Washington. The new chief inspector to take his place was a man named Michele Guittiere. I have no fucking clue how to say his name. I don't speak Italian. I speak my version of Italian. He was determined to prevent Pacciani from being acquitted, this new chief inspector. Also determined, as Spezzi pointed out, to use the Monster of Florence case as a means to advance his own career. So on February 13th, 1996, the day the verdict of the appeals court was to be announced, Chief Inspector Guttari now orders the arrest of another guy, Mario Vanni, for being the Monster of Florence's, a.k.a. Pacciani's accomplice. The 8th man arrested for being the monster, or connected to the monster. 9th if you count Stefano Mele from 1968. Vanni, the investigators claimed, was the man that serial witness Lorenzo Nessi, the guy who lied about the construction detour, had seen in the car with Pacciani the night the French tourists were murdered in 1985. This arrest, a direct challenge to the appeals court. That same day, an officer sent by Guttari dramatically burst into the courtroom, announces that 4 new witnesses in the Monster of Florence case have suddenly emerged. He refers to these witnesses only as Alpha, Beta, Gamma, and Delta. Claims that each of them had seen Pacciani commit the 1985 double homicide. This is big. Enraged at the interruption, the president of the Court of Appeals, Francesco Ferri, tells the officer either the anonymous witnesses come to court immediately and identify themselves and testify, or their existence will be ignored and no action will be taken. And now the officer refuses to identify the witnesses, and the trial continues as it had been. This whole investigation's a fucking circus.
Your Honor, I have a smoke in a gutter. I have to blow the case wide open. We must stop the presses.
The judge is like, okay, tell me what it is.
I cannot do that. I'm sorry for interrupting the things. I thought if I just said that, you might make this all go away. And now I feel a little bit stupider, and I'm just going to walk backwards out of the courtroom.
It's fucking insanity. Later that afternoon, Ferri stands before the court, declares the unequivocal and unconditional acquittal of Pacciani for being the Monster of Florence. And now we're back to square one. No one's behind bars. Whoever the Monster of Florence is, they're still likely free, if they're alive. Spezzi immediately gets to work identifying who those mysterious algebraic witnesses were, if they existed. And it doesn't take him long to find out they did. Alpha, Beta, Gamma, and Delta. He wrote in his I'm not going to fucking hold back or be worried about being politically correct style. Turned out to be, quote, quite a collection of half-wits and lowlifes. Alpha was a mentally retarded man named Pucci. Gamma was a prostitute named Girabelli in the final stages of alcoholism, known to turn a trick for a 25-cent glass of wine. Delta was a pimp named Gali. Jesus Christ. Beta was a man named Giancarlo Latti, a mentally handicapped alcoholic from the same village as Vanni, who spent his days, described in the source, drinking 2 liters of wine, loitering around town, strangely grinning at and bemusing his fellow citizens. These are their fucking all-star murder witnesses. Spezzi found out that Lottie was often subjected to pranks by local schoolboys. This poor bastard, they would chase him around, call him some racist Italian slur of jungle bunny, tell him things like, the Martians have landed on the soccer field, run! And then they would laugh while he would run to go look for the Martians. Jesus. No one had Delta, a.k.a. Lottie, not only had Delta, a.k.a. Lottie, claimed to have seen Pacciani murder the French tourists, he also confessed to helping commit those murders, even though he wasn't there. He would confess to anything that you wanted him to confess to, because he didn't know what he was saying. He just wanted to make people happy. This is just fucking sad. As Spezzi pointed out, and investigators actively ignored, Lottie's confession was very unconvincing. His description of the 1985 crime scene also contradicted literally all of the fucking evidence. He had no idea what he's talking about. For example, he told investigators he had seen Vanni slice the hole in the tent. He watched Pacciani crawl right through that hole, but there was no hole, right? The cut made in the French tourist tent only pierced the outermost layers we talked about. He also claimed he saw Vanni shot and wound the female victim, Nadine, while she was still in the car, that he watched as Vanni dragged the screaming woman out of the vehicle. Then he stabbed her to death in the nearby field, but she wasn't stabbed to death. The medical examiner established that Nadine was killed by the one shot. She got shot in the fucking head, went right into her brain. And then all the mutilations for sure done to her body after she died. More than that, there was no evidence at any of the crime scenes. that more than one killer was actually definitely present. Oh boy, February 22nd, 1998, Pacciani dies of a heart attack. Having been acquitted, he was technically a free man, but the investigation into who his alleged accomplices were proved too stressful for the sweet little lamb. He was afraid of getting retried. Rumors quickly spread that Pacciani had been murdered by someone who wanted to keep him from telling the world what he knew. Chief Inspector Giuttari, for one, fully believed this conspiracy and had the peasant farmer's body exhumed and tested for poisoning. What? If he knew some crazy secrets, why wouldn't he just share them while he was, fucking falsely imprisoned? As it turns out, Pacciani kind of was poisoned, but by his own heart medicine that he took himself. Most likely, as most people, or many people do, when they're having a heart attack, he panicked and he just took too many pills. However, Chief Inspector Giuttari did not buy this. He was certain Pacciani had been poisoned, which in his mind further demonstrated his guilt. May 20th, 1997, now the trial of Giancarlo Latti, the mentally handicapped alcoholic, and Mario Vanni, the guy Latti said did it based on no evidence, begins. Both men accused of being the monster of Florence, a.k.a. Pacciani's accomplices, even though Pacciani was found fucking innocent of being the monster. Holy shit. That was a trial where even the prosecutor thought he was innocent. Spezzi described the proceedings as, quote, a sad spectacle. Everything is a sad spectacle with the Italian judicial system in these fucking cases. 4 days later, March 24th, 1998, Latti and Vanni are convicted. 14 of the monster killings. So not the 1968 killings, but the other ones. Because, you know what? Fuck it. Why not? Even though they don't know anything about the crime scenes, even though there's literally no evidence connecting them to fucking anything. It's, you know what? It's Tuscany. When in Rome, when in Tuscany, you just throw people in jail and it doesn't matter if you have evidence or not. Vanni's given a life sentence. Lotti's given 26 years. Spezzi wrote, neither the press nor Italian public opinion seemed skeptical of the idea that 3 quasi-illiterate inebriates, this is how he wrote it, of marginal intelligence could have successfully killed over 14 people over a period of 11 years with the goal of stealing the women's sex organs. Jesus Christ. Despite these new convictions, investigation is still not over. It never ends. The question of why Pacciani and his picnicking friends stole the women's sex organs still remained, and Chief Inspector Giuttari was already hard at work pulling shit out of his ass to find the answer. His new theory, this is even better. This is better than anything we've talked about. His new theory, of course based on literally no evidence, because this is Tuscany, was that a top secret cabal of ultra elite and uber wealthy Satanists from around the world had hired these fucking 3 alcoholic, mentally handicapped men to kill couples and obtain women's vaginas to use as communion wafers and satanic black masses. I'm not even joking. Damn you, Illuminati! And the general public fucking completely accepts this. How the fuck did the culture that built the fucking Roman Empire, that produced a Renaissance, the culture that gave us Leonardo da Vinci and Michelangelo, Marco Polo and Galileo, delve into this fucking clown car of a society at this time? To investigate his new theory, Giuttari creates a new police unit called Gruppo Investigative the Serial Killings Investigative Group, aka Gides. I don't fucking know. Gides. Their sole mission was to unmask the masterminds, the satanic masterminds. Behind the so-called monster of Florence, they were tasked with finding these global Satanists and bringing them to justice. It's about time. Enough's enough. Fucking get them. Get your torches and pitchforks. To do this, Giuttari and his team relied heavily on insight provided by Gabriella Carlizzi, a woman living in Rome who was a complete fucking idiot lunatic. She's even more superstitious than anyone we've met so far. She ran a conspiracy website at the time, was a self-proclaimed expert on the alleged secret satanic sect she believed was behind literally all of the major crimes committed in Europe and America in the past 100 years. West Memphis 3 investigation vibes. Did you guys know that there was a secret satanic sect behind literally all of the major crimes committed in Europe and America in the 20th century? Nicole Brown? Yeah, maybe killed by OJ. Definitely killed by a direct order of secret Satanists. JFK, assassinated by Satanists. Bonnie and Clyde, Prohibition-era gangsters working on behalf of Satanists. John Benet Ramsey, sacrificed to Satan. Lindbergh baby, fucking devil got him. Oklahoma City bombing, thanks Beelzebub. Like in this lady's mind, this is real. This is the reality she's living in. And the police are like, oh, let's talk to her. Let's pay her to consult. Gabriella will soon claim that the secret sect, whom she called the School of the Red Rose, she just fucking made this shit up, was not only behind the monster of Florence killings, but also behind 9/11. Damn you, devil! August 1st, 2000. American thriller writer Douglas Preston arrives in Florence. A friend of his encouraged him to meet with journalist Mario Spezzi, who could tell him more about this fucking shit show. So much to talk about. During their first meeting, Spezzi tells Preston the ongoing story of the monster of Florence, which the author had never heard of. Immediately, he's hooked. The two agree to set about finding the real monster themselves. I mean, the police are certainly never going to do it. Jumping ahead a year, one day in the spring of 2001, Spezzi and Preston come to a new conclusion regarding who the monster of Florence is. They're still working on this case. Well, at least Spezzi is, after nearly 3 decades. Douglas Preston thought it was likely Salvatore Vinci. But the old FBI profile on the monster of Florence didn't match Salvatore. The profile was insistent on one crucial point. The monster of Florence was impotent. Salvatore Vinci was the opposite of impotent. Salvatore didn't match the rest of the FBI report very well either. Preston asked, but if Salvatore Vinci isn't the monster, then you still have the problem of how the Beretta passed from him to the monster. He then asked, was it stolen from him? Spezzi thought maybe it was, but by who? By his son, perhaps, Antonio Vinci. When they really looked into him, now they find what they felt was overwhelming evidence that he was the guy. In 1974, 4 months before the monster's likely first killings, as far as that's new style that was not in the 1968 killings, Salvatore Vinci filed a complaint to the police that his son Antonio had broken into his house. When police asked him what was stolen, he wouldn't say. Spezzi believed that Salvatore actually did know what was stolen, but telling the police what was stolen would have gotten him into trouble from the 1968 murders. He thinks it was his gun, the monster of Florence killing's murder weapon. Antonio Vinci, the journalist also found, matched the FBI profile almost to a T. The report said the monster would not have a history of extremely violent crimes, but a rap sheet of minor infractions. Antonio had been charged with illegal possession of weapons, breaking and entering, arson, auto theft. Reports said the killer most likely would try to mislead investigators, or on multiple occasions, Antonio had offered himself up as an informant for the police. The report said the killer would strike in places he knew well. When Spezzi mapped out Antonio's life, he found that during the period each double homicide was committed, Antonio did live in the area. The report said the killer was most likely in his 20s. At the time of his first killing, Antonio was younger than that, just 15, but he was man-sized. The report said the killer had his own car. Antonio had been a car owner since he was a teen. The report and the evidence indicated that the killer was impotent. Well, Antonio had never had a girlfriend that anybody really knew about, but he was married just one time between 1982 to 1985, and then that marriage was annulled for non-consummation, as in they never fucked, which definitely points towards, very likely impotence. Finally, Spezzi told Preston studies of serial killers often turn up a history of maternal abandonment and sexual abuse within the family unit. Antonio's mother was murdered when he was a year old. He suffered a second traumatic separation from a mother figure when his father's longtime girlfriend left, and he may have been exposed to his father's bizarre sexual activities. He was living with his father in a small place while his father presided over sex parties involving men, women, perhaps even children. Did his father force him to participate? There's no evidence that he did or didn't. A few days later, Preston and Spezzi are sitting in Antonio Vinci's living room. Mario tells him that Preston, is a journalist writing an article about the monster for The New Yorker, and that he is acting as his translator. They chat amiably about the case. Slowly, Spezzi starts to ease into the subject of Salvatore, daring to ask Antonio about the robbery complaint his father filed against him in 1974. That's not quite right, replied Antonio. Since he couldn't say if I'd taken anything, I was only charged for violation of domicile. Another time we had a fight and I pinned him, planting my scuba knife in his throat. But he managed to get away and I locked myself in the bathroom. Well, the scuba knife revelation was incredible since that was the specific kind of weapon used to cut out the women's vaginas in several cases. And stabbed that one woman 97 times. The chief medical examiner, Dr. Mauro Mari, who'd examined every single one of the monster's victims, had concluded since the very beginning that the monster used a blade with a very specific type of notch in it, most likely a scuba knife, to stab victims. At the end of their conversation, nonchalantly, Spezzi asked Antonio, if your father owned the .22 caliber Beretta, you were the person in the best position to take it, perhaps during the violation of domicile in the spring of 1974. I have proof I didn't take it, responded Antonio, smiling. If I had taken it, I would have fired it into my father's forehead. Spezzi pressed on. You were away from Florence from 1975 to 1980, precisely during the time there was no killings. When you returned, they began again. Antonio responded, those were the best years of my life. I had a house, I ate well, all those girls. And then Antonio made a gesture like he was fucking someone, trying to prove he's, not impotent. So you're not the monster of Florence. No, I like my pussy alive, Antonio answered and grinned. Throughout the entire interview, Antonio never stopped smiling until he was walking Spezzi and pressing out the door. Then he abruptly stopped in front of the journalist, leaned into his face until he was just inches away from Spezzi's face, and then said in a threatening tone, "Listen carefully. I don't play games." Creepy. Not necessarily, hard evidence that he's the guy, but they're making a good case. Preston and Spezzi immediately get to work writing an article about their interview with Antonio, submitted to the New Yorker. It was scheduled for publication in the third week of September 2001. The article also outlined with striking logic how it was impossible that Pacciani and his picnicking friends were the monsters of Florence, and that it was even more impossible that a satanic sect was behind the killings, as Chief Inspector Giuttari still strongly believed. Spezzi knew that despite Rotella removing himself from the case, the carabinieri that worked for him were still secretly investigating the circle of Sardinians that Salvatore ran in, which was tricky because they did not like to cooperate with authorities thanks to that Barbagian code. Still, one of the journalists, carabinieri informants, had told him they discovered something huge and that they were simply waiting for the right moment to reveal the results of this secret investigation. Spezzi hoped the publication of the New Yorker article would be the right moment they were waiting for. But before that could happen, Al-Qaeda struck. And in the wake of 9/11, the New Yorker decided to scrap the Italian monster story. Preston and Spezzi tried to get their article published elsewhere, but were shut down now each and every time. And now that informant who's going to share this, secret revelation goes quiet. Jumping ahead several months to April 6, 2002, the body of we're going to get real weird again. The body of a Peruvian doctor named Francesco Narducci, who committed suicide by drowning himself in Lake Trasimeno in 1984, is exhumed at the behest of Chief Inspector Giuttari. For 2 years, Giuttari had been investigating his theory that the mysterious Satanic Order of the Red Rose was behind the monster killings, but had made little to no progress because it's ridiculous. That was until he received a call from the public minister of Perugia, Giuliano Mignini. Mignini told the chief inspector that he had on good authority that Narducci had been murdered by the Order of the Red Rose Satanists, which the doctor himself was a member of. The good authority from which Mignini received this vital information? None other than batshit crazy conspiracy theorist Gabriele Carlisi. Carlisi informed him with a straight face, I assume, that Narducci's role in this satanic sect was to guard the severed vaginas. The monsters of Florence, a.k.a. Pacciani and his picnicking friends, had removed from female victims. However, the doctor was becoming unreliable. I guess he was napping when he was supposed to be on severed puss watch or something. So the order has him killed, and to cover it up, they swap out Narducci's body with a fucking decoy corpse. If this reads as confusing to you, that's a good thing. It should read as confusing because this is gibberish. But Mignini and Giuttari take this as fact. When Narducci's body is exhumed, medical examiners confirmed that, it was his body. It's not a decoy, obviously. Mignini immediately concludes that this meant that the decoy body had now been replaced. There was a decoy body for sure, and now they fucking swapped it back with Narducci's real body, which for some reason they'd been carefully preserving for 17 years, he said, because that's how satanic sects, they do things when they know something is, I don't know. Do you remember the name Giuliano Mignini? We met him in the Amanda Knox episode. 5 years after his involvement here in this case, in 2007, Mignini will lead the prosecution against former Suck subject Amanda Knox, an American girl who was wrongfully convicted of murdering her roommate while studying abroad in Perugia, Italy. Mignini argued that Knox was demonically motivated to kill her roommate. In the end, Italy's Supreme Court finally said that the case was marked by culpable omissions of investigative activity, contradictory evidence, and stunning flaws in the investigation. In the end, right, this guy was just shown to be a wildly corrupt official who was fucking terrible at his job, always looking for satanic involvement in the crimes he investigated, and yet he worked as a highly regarded public prosecutor in Italy for 41 fucking years. Dear God. Now remember that granite doorstop, that little pyramid doorstop, commonly sold around Tuscany, found at the scene of the October 21st, 1981 double homicide. I asked you to remember. Well, around the same time in 2002, Giuttari's, GIDES squad discovers a similar-looking doorstop near a villa where Pacciani had previously worked as a gardener. And this, according to Giuttari and Mignini, undeniable proof of involvement of a satanic sect linked, that like to eat, severed vaginas. They told the press that the doorstops were not actually doorstops. These are highly regarded officials. They said they're not doorstops. They're esoteric objects used to communicate between this world and the infernal regions. Holy fucking shit. these public officials are saying that not only is there a vagina-eating satanic sect behind the Monster of Florence murders, but they have these little communication portals scattered around so they can, talk to demons easier, or maybe fucking teleport back and forth from hell. I mean, you would think, wouldn't you, that if they had these kind of portals, they would be powerful enough to just kill the investigators who were onto them. These people are so fucking stupid, it drives me crazy. I hate the people this fucking crazy are in positions of power. They're getting paid well for jobs that they should. January of 2004, the fucking A-team, Genius GIDES squad, now searches the home of an ex-pharmacist in San Casciano named Francesco Calamandrei. Yes, he is also a puss-hungry satanic fuck. The investigators believe that this guy is a member of the Order of the Red Rose and one of the masterminds behind the monster killings. He's also one of Spezzi's oldest friends. Coincidence? In 1991, this poor bastard's ex-wife, who had tragically succumbed to a severe case of schizophrenia and was living in a sanatorium for the mentally ill, wrote to the police accusing her ex-husband of being the Monster of Florence. Back when everyone was accusing people of being the Monster of Florence constantly. At the time, investigators checked out the letter and deemed it was absurd. It was the ramblings of someone with, severe mental illness. However, when Jatari stumbles across it over a decade later, because he is also insane, he finds it to be very legitimate. Almost immediately afterwards, Jatari miraculously produces 3 witnesses claiming to have seen Francesco Narducci, the doctor who died by suicide, drowning himself in Lake Trasimeno in 1984, and Calamandrei, who was hanging out together with these guys back in the early 80s. Author Douglas Preston will later write, when Spezzi first heard the names, he thought it was a bad joke. They were the same algebraic witnesses, Alpha and Gamma, who had been the surprise witnesses at Pacciani's appeal trial many years before. Pucci, the mentally handicapped man who claimed to have witnessed Pacciani killing the French couple, and Garibelli, the alcoholic prostitute who would turn a trick for a glass of wine. And then a third witness popped out of the woodwork, none other than Lorenzo Nessi, the same fine fellow who had so conveniently remembered Pacciani and a companion in a reddish car a kilometer from the Scopetti clearing on Sunday night, the alleged night of the murder of the French tourist. That's the guy who, had to take a detour because of road construction that wasn't actually there. It feels like they just have these fucking Three Stooges. They just keep in a fucking closet. And they're like, hey, we need some witnesses. Fucking get them. And then they just play this music. And the guys just run out and just like, what do you want me to say? I say it. Just give me some wine. I tell you what you want to say. May 14th, 2004. On an episode of Who Has Seen Him, about the history of the Monster of Florence. This episode airs on Italian television. In this episode, Spezzi discusses all the errors made during the investigation, dismantles conspiracy theories being spun by Giuttari, by Magnini, makes them look like the fucking idiots they are. At one point during the show, Spezzi holds up a granite doorstop, identical to the ones Giuttari claimed were esoteric objects, these portals. And it's like, this is just a doorstop. This is a commonly sold doorstop. Like you could get it at the fucking equivalent of Target over there. The episode also features an internationally renowned expert in forensic entomology named Francesco Introna. Spezzi had reached out to him a year prior to help solve some of the lingering questions about the monster's killings. Well, on the show, Francesco Introna explains that based on the developmental phase of the larvae in the victims' bodies, those French tourists absolutely had to have died on Saturday, September 7th, 1985, not Sunday, September 8th, which just fucking blows away their whole case. Right? Those guys, they weren't there, but even if they were there on Sunday, they wouldn't have seen the murder because the murder didn't happen on Sunday. So more evidence that Lorenzo Nessi did not witness shit. As we went over earlier in the timeline, self-confessing eyewitnesses, Alpha, Beta, Gamma, Delta, the Four Stooges, all claimed to have seen, or in Lottie's case, helped Pacciani kill the French tourist on Sunday, September 8th. Spezzi now explains, the entomological evidence proved, as if more proof were needed, that Pacciani and his alleged accomplices had nothing to do with the Monster of Florence killings. It also therefore demolished the satanic sect theory, which had been built entirely on the guilt of Pacciani, the false confession of Lottie, and the testimony of these other algebraic witnesses that will say anything anybody wants them to say. Unfortunately, after the episode was aired, nothing happens. The press does not write about it. Both prosecutors' offices, police ignore it. Only impact that Spezzi's episode seemed to have was that it really pissed off Chief Inspector Giuttari. On June 25th, 2004, Douglas Preston and his family moved back to Maine. Through phone and email, he and Spezzi continued co-writing their book on the Monster of Florence. At 6:15 the morning of November 18th, 2004, Spezzi's home is searched by 7 police officers now. Before he answers the door, he grabbed the floppy disk containing he and Preston's book, shoved it into his, down into his underwear. One of the officers, a commander from Giuttari's GIDES squad, let's call him Gids, I guess, handed him a piece of paper that read, search warrant information and guarantee to the accused on the right of defense. The person named above is hereby under official investigation for having committed the following crimes. Literally reads off so many letters. A, B, C, D, E, F, G, H, I, J, K, L, M, N, O, P, Q, R, then stops. None of the lettered crimes were specified. And when Spezzi asked the officer, well, what were they? He replied that information was under judicial order of secrecy. This is a bunch of bullshit. The warrant's letterhead read, Office of the Public Prosecutor in the Tribunal of Perugia. The warrant stated that Spezzi was being searched because he evinced a peculiar and suspicious interest toward the Perugian branch of the investigation, and that he demonstrated a zealous effort in attempting to undermine the investigation through the medium of television. So that fucking idiot, Giuliano Mignini, the public minister of Perugia, just blatantly abusing his power to arrest this journalist for making him look bad on TV. Officers now took Spezzi's entire archive of almost 30 years of research into the Monster of Florence, as well as all the material he was using to write his book with Preston. They didn't get the book itself, however. During the search, while Spezzi gave his wife Miriam a hug goodbye, he slipped the diskette into her jacket pocket and whispered for her to hide it. That morning, the police left Spezzi's house relatively intact. However, later that day, Miriam calls her husband at the police barracks and speaks to him in French. It was an innocent thing to do. They habitually spoke French in their trilingual household. But the investigators that had tapped Spezzi's phone found it suspicious. Of course they did. Now that afternoon, the police returned to Spezzi's home to conduct a second search with a vengeance. This time, they fucking destroy the place. For the first time, Spezzi loses his cool. While the officers search his library for a second time, Spezzi gestures to his granite doorstop on the floor, the one he used in the TV special. And he said, you see that? It's like the truncated pyramid found at the scene of one of the crimes, which you insist on claiming is an esoteric object. There it is. Take a good look. Can't you see it's just a doorstep? You find them everywhere, in Tuscan country houses. The officer doesn't say a thing, just simply seizes the doorstop, packs it away as evidence. A few months later, news hits the papers. Mario Spezzi is being investigated for being the Monster of Florence now. He is one of the puss-eating Satanists. They found a doorstop that proved it. His little fucking telecom that you could talk to the devil with. According to Mignini and Spezzi, Spezzi owning a doorstop identical to the ones found at the 1981 Bartolini Fields crime scene and at Pacciani's former workplace was proof that the journalist was indeed connected to those crimes. Definitely couldn't just be a doorstop. Man, the conspiratorial mind, so good at making connections that don't exist. January 24, 2005, Mario Spezzi's home searched by the police again. They don't find anything important because there's nothing there. February 13, 2006, author Douglas Preston now returns to Italy for a little meeting with his co-author. For 2 years now, Chittari and Mignini had been investigating Spezzi, but the exact charges being levied against the journalist still never made clear because those ass clowns are corrupt as fuck. While researching a story unrelated to the Monster of Florence, Spezzi had recently come into contact with one of Antonio Vinci's former friends named Luigi Ruaco. Antonio being the child of the 17-year-old Barbarina, likely murdered in 1961 in Sardinia by Antonio's dad, Salvatore Vinci. Salvatore, one of the lovers of Barbara Locci, wife of Stefano Mele, who went to prison for Barbara's murder in 1968. She was the woman killed in that car that year while having sex with another lover, while her son, Natalino, was also in the car. Salvatore, also thought to be the Monster of Florence at one point, one of the biggest suspects, as was his brother Francesco, Antonio's uncle. And Antonio was the man that Mario Spezzi and Douglas Preston ended up thinking was most likely the Monster of Florence. The man with the scuba knife. The man who kind of threatened them when they left his apartment. The man who could have stolen a gun his dad used to kill Barbara and her lover in 1968, then used that gun for future killings beginning in 1974. And Luigi informed Spezzi that during the period the monster was active, Antonio had set up a safe house in an abandoned property in the countryside. Luigi also said that his other friend, Ignacio, had even visited the safe house with Antonio the month prior, and inside he saw 6 locked metal boxes and 3 pistols. 6 boxes for 6 female victims, Spezzi wondered. The FBI report said that the killer probably took souvenirs from each of the women he killed, even if it wasn't their severed vaginas. A few days after he arrived in Italy, Preston, Spezzi, and Zaccaria, the man who had introduced Spezzi to Luigi, were on their way to a sprawling 1,000-acre public estate called Villa Bibbiani. They drove to the far end of the park until they found a little muddy dirt road with an abandoned structure at the end of it, Antonio's alleged safe house. Although Preston wanted to take a closer look, Spezzi forbid it, feeling like it was too dangerous, worried that it might get them killed, so they turned around and left. They feared what Antonio might do to them if he found out that they were the ones who turned him in. So Spezzi and Preston hatched a plan to give the police an anonymous letter with information about the safe house. few days later, after they visit the villa, Spezzi calls Preston and tells him, we did it. We did it all. Preston knew what that meant. Spezzi successfully handed off the anonymous letter to the police. But now on February 22nd, 2006, Douglas Preston, not Antonio Vinci, now receives a legal summons to appear before the public minister of Perugia, Judge Giuliani Mignini, for an interrogation. At the beginning of the interrogation, Mignini seemed mostly interested in how well Preston knew Spezzi and what their theories about the monster of Florence were. But a few hours into it, Mignini's tone turns accusatory. He starts hurling questions at Preston about his visit to Villa Bibbiani with Spezzi and Zaccaria. The judge also played for Preston a recording of Spezzi telling him over the phone, we did it all. Right? What did that mean? What exactly did you guys do? Is that code? What's it code for? Is this a confession to the murders? Are you also members of the Satanic Order of the Red Rose? Over and over and over again, Mignini plays the cell phone conversation for Preston until he finally proclaims, you and Spezzi either planted or were planning to plant a gun or other false evidence at the villa in an attempt to frame an innocent man for being the monster of Florence, to derail this investigation, and to deflect suspicion from Spezzi himself. That is what you were doing. The comment, we did it all, that's what he meant. Well, Preston denies all this vehemently. At the end of the interrogation, Mignini now informs Preston he's officially being indicted for the crimes of reticence and making false statements. The investigation into Preston will be suspended, though, for a few days to allow him to leave Italy if he should so choose, but if he ever comes back, he will be immediately arrested. So that's a not-so-subtle way to get Preston to get the fuck out of the country and stop making Mignini look like the corrupt moron he is. Preston and his family on the next flight out of Florence. On April 7, 2006, Mario Spezzi, now arrested for obstructing the investigation of the murder of Francesco Narducci, taken in handcuffs to a prison in Perugia. Mignini and Giutari made it clear to the press that Spezzi was also suspected of planting false evidence at Villa Bibbiani to divert attention away from their investigation, linking Spezzi to the Satanic sect and to being the monster of Florence. Before Mario's arrest, Preston wrote, we would later learn Villa Bibbiani and its grounds were searched by the men of guides, whatever, looking for the gun, objects, boxes, or documents we were supposed to have planted. Nothing was found. To the ever-resourceful Giutari, this was not at all a problem. He had acted so promptly, he said, that we didn't have time to carry out our nefarious plot. He had stopped it dead in its tracks. Against Spezzi, Mignini invoked a law that denied him access to a lawyer and ensured he was kept in isolation. In Italy, this law is typically reserved for terrorists or mafia kingpins. The purpose of it is to prevent the incarcerated criminal from ordering a hit on somebody from inside their cell. To use it against a journalist here is just more evidence of how corrupt these assholes are. April 12, 2006, after 5 days in isolation, during which he was never told what the specific charges against him were, or why he was even being kept in isolation, Spezzi is now allowed to meet with his lawyers. Later that day, he attends a hearing in front of Judge Marina de Robertis. Purpose of the hearing, to determine if Spezzi's arrest and incarceration are justified, and if he poses a danger to society. Public Minister Giuliano Mignini also appeared before the judge and argued that Spezzi was not only obstructing the investigation, but that the journalist was, quote, at the center of a genuine disinformation campaign not unlike that which might be undertaken by a deviant secret service, wink, wink, deviant as in satanic order. The disinformation campaign Mignini was referring to was all the articles in the book Spezzi had written critiquing Mignini's investigation into the supposed satanic sect behind the killings. Should be noted that during Mignini's long speech, he presented not a single piece of forensic evidence. When it was Spezzi's turn to take the stand, the judge asked him just one question. Can you guess what it is? Have you ever belonged to a satanic sect? They just won't fucking quit! Why is the judge asking this question? What would that even prove? How is this happening in 2006? Feels like 1306. Spezzi laughed. He said, the only order I'm a member of is the Order of Journalists. In the end, Judge de Robertis ruled that Spezzi must remain in prison because he was a danger to society. Yeah, that'll teach him. That'll teach you for laughing at him about the fucking devil question. This is just ridiculous. April 28, 2006, Spezzi now appears before the Tribunal of Re-Examination. He's been in prison for 3 weeks for nothing. His hearing lasts 7 hours and 40 minutes. They like a long hearing. After Mignini recites the judges a long and rambling speech about Spezzi's enormous dangerousness, and at one point even claims that even though Spezzi denied being in the satanic sect behind the monster killings, he had recently come to possess extremely delicate and sensitive material that proved the journalist was lying and was indeed a member of this fictitious order. When Spezzi finally took the stand, he later told Preston it was one of the single most glorious moments of his life. He proceeded to dismantle every single one of the idiot Mignini's bullshit accusations, quote, bulldozing his rickety conspiracy logic and pointed out that Mignini lacked any physical evidence at all to back up his theories. The journalist ended by saying, I am only a journalist who tries his best to do what is right in his job, and I'm a good person. Next day, April 29, 2006, Mario Spezzi released from prison. The tribunal had ruled that he was absolutely and unconditionally free. But because they're corrupt, vindictive pieces of shit, Mignini and Giuttari immediately sent an appeal to the Supreme Court, and then they reject it. September 27, 2007, the trial of Francesco Calamandre, that ex-pharmacist and old friend of Spezzi's, it begins. He stood accused of being one of the Satan-worshipping masterminds behind the monster killings. Mm-hmm. And his trial lasted 8 months. Even though the prosecution had literally no evidence, he did anything. Check this out. May 21st, 2008, the judge announced his verdict. Francesco Calamandre was acquitted for the reason that the allegation is non-existent. In other words, not only was Calamandre innocent, but the crime he was accused of committed never occurred in the first place, meaning the judge felt that the satanic sect, right, masterminding of the Monster of Florence killings was a bunch of just nonsense. It took the court 8 fucking months, though, to figure that out. 2010, Chief Inspector Michele Giuttari and Public Minister, or Michele, sorry, I don't know how to say his first name, and Public Minister Giuliano Mignini are now convicted of abuse of office. Right? Finally, it looks like maybe some actual justice getting served, but not really because they'll win on appeal and not get in trouble for doing anything wrong. And they'll just, in the meantime, just continually fuck over other people's lives thanks to their weird hard-ons for hidden Satanists. September 9th, 2016, Mario Spezzi dies after a long battle with an unknown illness. On his memoriam for Spezzi, Preston will write, long after Mario's arrest and release, Giuliano Mignini and Michele Giuttari continued to file criminal charges against him. The Italian courts repeatedly dismissed those charges, only to have the prosecutor and police file new and slightly revised charges. This judicial vendetta went on for almost a decade and caused Mario and his family severe economic distress. His doctors say this unrelenting harassment contributed greatly to his ill health, and I have no doubt hastened his death. Not a single one of those charges ever led to a conviction. Giuliano Mignini now retires as a public prosecutor years later in 2020. He'll continue, though, to work as a special investigative consultant for the Italian court systems. That's cool. And actually, just 2 years ago, in 2022, he submitted a 120-page report on the Monster of Florence, still concluding that a secret order of Satanists, the mysterious Order of the Red Rose, was behind the murders and used removed vaginas for black mass sacraments. Also still believed that the Peruvian doctor named Francesco Narducci, who committed suicide by drowning himself in Lake Trasimeno in 1984, was a member of that order, that his job was to guard the severed vaginas, and that the doctor was becoming unreliable, so the order had him killed. And to cover it up, they swapped Narducci's body with a decoy corpse body. So he's still dumb as shit. And the real Monster of Florence, whoever they are, maybe Antonio Vinci, fuck it, maybe, you know what, why not? Let's say the Monster of Florence, I'm going to say that my guess for the Monster of Florence is Giuliano Mignini. Just because I hate him. Yeah, but the look for the real killer, goes on. His identity is still officially unknown. And that'll take us out of this timeline.
Good job, soldier. You made it back. Barely.
The Monster of Florence, crazy murders, but a crazier trial, right? Remember when I said that I know that there are many smart, logical, decent Italian people, just like there are smart, logical, decent people in every nation, every culture, every race, but that not many of those people would show up in this episode? Holy shit, I hope you understand what I was talking about now. Remind me to never, ever get arrested for anything in Italy. Oh my God. If I ever get accused of anything while I'm in Italy, I'm just going to flee immediately, never return. And how about them hill peepers, right? An entire community of men dedicated to watching young couples fuck in their cars outside the city of Florence. Some dudes even worked as guides, like tour guides. I was talking about how crazy that is to my son Kyler, who is home from college on summer break. And he actually brought up a great point that I hadn't thought of. Some of those pervs had to have known who the Monster of Florence was, right? He preyed on couples fucking in cars in the hills around Florence, and those hills were littered with dudes watching couples fuck all the time. Some pervs had to have seen at least one of the couples get murdered, and then they just wouldn't say anything, I guess, to the authorities because they didn't want to publicly reveal themselves to be a perv, beaten off in the bushes. Talking about this, Kyle and I were picturing like a really cartoonish scene unfolding directly after the monster of Florence, leaves each of his crime scenes. Just as soon as like the killer drives away or like walks away, whatever. So many dudes come out of their hiding places, like crazy hiding. They just like step out of hollow decoy tree stumps, lower themselves by rope out of trees, literally crawl from underneath rocks, sneak out from underneath the car, suddenly move after staying completely frozen like a statue disguised as a bush for, an hour. Just gather together, smoking some cigarettes, talking about what a shame it was, that another hot couple got murdered.
What a shame. She was shot before I come. I was gonna come over by the body, but he cut out of my favorite part of such a nice young lady. What a waste of a Saturday night. All of the other good hiding spots are taken now. What am I gonna do? How am I gonna beat off for tonight? I got the blues of balls.
Now with that nonsense over, let's recap.
Timesuck Top 5 Takeaways.
Number 1, between 1974 and 1985, the monster of Florence murdered 14 people, all of whom were unmarried couples having sex in their vehicles in the woods that surround Florence. Number 2, in 1981, after the murder of Giovanni Foggi and Carmela De Nuccio, investigators re-examined 2 previous double homicides. One from 1968, supposedly committed by a man named Stefano Mele. One from 1974 that was never solved. A ballistics lab later will reveal that the shell casings collected from each of the crime scenes all bear the same distinct mark, meaning all 6 people were killed with the same gun. Whoever killed the 14 couples between 1974 and 1985 likely also killed that couple in 1968, or at least the same gun was used. Number 3, in 2 decades, almost a dozen people were arrested for, convicted, or officially suspected of being the monster of Florence based on little to no evidence. The most significant of these was Salvatore Vinci, who was acquitted and disappeared in 1988, and Pietro Pacciani, who was convicted, then acquitted on appeal, then looked like he was going to probably stand trial again, and then he died. Number 4, in 2006, Mario Spezzi was arrested for obstructing Giuttari and Mignini's investigation into the Satanic cult they believed to be behind the monster killings. They suspected Spezzi openly criticized their investigation because he himself was part of this powerful cult and could be the monster of Florence. Number 5, new info. How about some nice info about Sardinia? I talked earlier about the Barbagian Code and the exalting of the Valente, the wily outlaw, the man of cunning, skill, and courage who takes care of his own. That is not what Sardinia is most known for. It's mostly known now, I would say, for longevity. Sardinia is one of the world's 5 blue zones, places around the world where an unusually large number of people live to be 100 or older. As of August 2021, Sardinia had 534 people who were 100 years old or older, which is 33.6 centenarians per 100,000 people, which puts Sardinia in a tie with Okinawa, Japan, for the highest ratio of centenarians in the world, nearly 10 times more per capita than the U.S. For these vibrant Sardinian senior citizens, what they eat plays an important role in their longevity. Meat is used sparingly. Much of the food in Sardinia is locally grown, free of pesticides, hormones, dyes, and sugars. Here's what you'll find in a typical Sardinian menu. Vegetables, greens, salads, bean soups with fennel, fava beans, chickpeas, and tomatoes. Goat and sheep's milk products, which have anti-inflammatory properties and have been found to lower bad cholesterol. Sardinian red wine from the mountaintop regions, which has higher levels of polyphenols than most other wines. Polyphenols are antioxidants that can protect against ailments like diabetes and heart disease. Their signature flatbread, made out of high-protein, low-gluten whole grain, also the main ingredient in their pasta. Milk thistle tea, thought to clean the liver, is enjoyed daily. Reverence for and inclusion of elder generations also thought to play a big part in people living longer lives there. Unlike in the U.S., where elderly people live separately in retirement or nursing homes, Sardinians do not dismiss their elders. If anything, they promote them. Not only are older people revered for their hard-earned, long-lived wisdom, they're also put to work, if able, like everyone else in the family. They're given, as a callback to last week, a purpose. Sebastian Pires, a photographer and filmmaker from Sardinia, who now lives in New York City, but maintains a home there and visits often, says that commonly older family members live with their own grown children. Usually there will be 2 or 3 generations of a family living in the same household. If older people do move out, they're checked on every day by their family. The family connection is extremely tight, and there's an effort to keep the family together. Another big component contributing to the longevity of Sardinians may be the amount of exercise people do every day. Because of the steep mountainous nature of the landscape and the active lifestyle, they're getting low intensity and medium intensity exercise all the time. There are dozens of periods of physical exertion throughout the day, and people are not driving for the most part, they're walking. And another big part of longevity supposedly is a lower stress level from a different focus on careers. They don't really focus on careers. Having a big career and making lots of money is not valued in Sardinia like it is in America. They place a lot more value on balance. You're not expected to work yourself to the point of burning out just to get ahead. A lot of people work just enough to pay their bills, maybe save a bit, and then that's it. They're not trying to build an empire. They're just trying to spend as much time with family and friends as possible. Rather than waking up thinking about how to advance in their career, they're waking up thinking about how their children, grandchildren, and great-grandchildren are thriving. So despite how fucking crazy this episode was, I do still want to get back and visit Italy and Sardinia now. High on my list for that.
Ding. Yippee!
I will just make sure not to joke at all about Satan over there. Maybe wear a cross necklace. Probably cover up most of my tattoos to avoid getting arrested for some shit I did not do.
Timesuck Top 5 Takeaways.
The monster of Florence has been sucked. Thank you to the Bad Magic production team for the help in making Timesuck, starting with Queen of Bad Magic, Lindsay Cummins. Thank you to Logan Keith, recording this episode, designing merch for the store at badmagicproductions.com. Thank you to Molly Box for initial research this week. Also, thank you to the All Seeing Eyes moderating the Cult of the Curious private Facebook page, the Mod Squad, making sure Discord keeps running smooth, and everyone over on the Timesuck subreddit and Bad Magic subreddits. And now let's head on over to this week's Timesucker updates.
Updates? Get your Timesucker updates.
I have 3 pretty meaty Larry Nassar updates today. Starting with marvelous meat sack Matthew Choma, who wrote in with the subject line of, I've come to talk to you about kitty porn, but not in the way you think. Sorry, I think I maybe misread that there. Dan Cummins, you sexy sucker, you. I've been listening for about 4 years and a space station for almost the entire time. I would change 3 out of 5 stars, but I would change one thing. I believe this one is important, especially after hearing it brought up frequently in the Larry Nassar and the U.S. gymnastics scandal suck. While the legal term child pornography is correct, child advocates and those working with victims use different language. My fiance and Annabelle, thank you, Kyla, the Y sounds like the I in kite, so it's Kyla, works for the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children, NCMEC, and wanted me to share that they advise people to refer to child pornography as child sexual abuse material, or CSAM. She constantly corrects you out loud as she is listening to your backlog, and I'm doing this for her future sanity. I think this distinction is important. The word porn implies that there is consent and children cannot give their consent. As you hate pedos as much as I do, I thought you might enjoy a better phrase to emphasize how sick these fuckers are. Yeah, since this centers around Kyla, I'd like to lighten the mood now by sharing how you've traumatized her with your lies. 1, I started binging the suck right before we made a major move to DC from Texas. With the 24-hour drive ahead of us, I downloaded several episodes to pass the time. I had listened to the Marilyn Monroe suck weeks before this, and was already aware of Bojangles. Kyla was not. As we neared our destination, you began to describe our one-eyed, three-legged anti-communist mascot, and her eyes lit up. I paused the episode, detailed his entire mythos. Halfway through, her excitement faded, as she realized Bojangles was not a real pit bull. She is still depressed by this fact. And I constantly remind her. 2, Kyla has enjoyed Scared to Death for some time, and I finally converted her to the cult this year as well, Hail Nimrod. After I finished listening to your harrowing tale of old Dickie Bird, I told her she needed to listen to it next with no additional context. Kyla put all music and other Timesuck backlog listening on pause, focused on sucking on Hairbrush in the Ass Bird. As soon as she finished, she called me to let me know her displeasure. With my insistence that she listen, there was a lot of swearing and yelling involved. If this isn't too long, I'm not apologizing. I'd like to once again shout out to my amazing Annabelle Kyla. She is the most loving, empathetic, and brilliant meat sack I've ever met. Her only flaw is her lack of submission, but hopefully you can give me advice on this, preferably before we get married next March. If only I knew. I also want to shout out some awesome suckers on the Discord channel. And lastly, the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children, and NCMEC. Again, with all the awful pieces of shit we learn about, especially those who target the most vulnerable, NCMEC does so much good for the survivors, victims, and their families. If you've never looked into NCMEC, It all started with the OG true crime man, John Walsh, and it is a fantastic, if not devastating at times, story that might be a good future suck topic. Thank you to you, the Queen, all the other members of Bad Magic for what you do. Having this podcast as an escape week to week helps me during hard and stressful times. Well, thank you, Matthew. Honestly, escaping into the research of these topics helps me de-stress a lot as well. So it's mutual escapism often. Thank you for the correction regarding child sexual abuse material. I will do my best to try and remember to use that term. There is no consent in videos of naked kids. There can't be, even if they were to say yes. They don't realize what they're agreeing to. I hope Kyla keeps fighting the good fight. There really are so many good people in the world. So easy to forget, especially with these topics, but so true. Now another email sent in with the very direct subject line of simply Larry Nassar episode. Sent in by a great man of the first name of Greg. Load the Greg. Aim the Greg. Fire the Greg. Hey there, Dan, the Timesuck man. I started to listen in 2020 after my mom passed away. The job I had at the time had me working by myself, and it was tough to work while going through the loss. Your podcast helped me focus, got me laughing again, so thanks for that. The Nassar episode hit close to home for me. I hope all parents take this episode as a warning to listen to their kiddos. I became friends with a jiu-jitsu instructor in my hometown before my wife and I had kids. We did a few months of training ourselves, but soon were unable to continue. I stayed friends with the instructor for many years. He was ex-military, former law enforcement. He would train the local sheriff and city police, while doing training, as well as doing training at the local Air Force base. He would go to schools and do self-defense sessions with tons of kids. When I had a daughter, I looked forward to the day she would be able to train with him. When the time came, I started taking her to classes. The day she started, she was nervous, didn't want to get on the mat to do any of the exercises. The instructor, this guy, came and talked to her and convinced her to just come sit by him as they finished class. From that day on, she was all about the classes. Even made it a point to give the instructor a high five after each class. I was lucky enough, in many ways, as it turns out, to be able to help her in training since the instructor was a friend. I was the one that would help her and the other kids she was paired with demonstrate moves after he first showed the class. As time went on, she excelled at her training. She would get stripes on her belt she was extremely proud of. It's fucking awesome. Anytime someone asked about self-defense classes for their kids, I would praise this guy's gym, push for parents to take their kids to his gym. But after 3 years of training, my daughter decided she didn't want to do jiu-jitsu anymore. I was extremely disappointed, tried all I could to try and get her to get back into it. Thankfully, she never went back to train. Fast forward a couple years. She tells me she wants to go to class to just watch. I was beyond excited. Hell yeah, she's ready to start training again. Few days later, another parent messages me a mugshot of that instructor. He had been picked up for child pornography, right? For this sexual abusive material. I was devastated. I wouldn't believe it. There was no way this man that has such a remarkable standing in the community did any of this. Then his police interview came out. He admitted to everything, every fucking thing. The police found videos, pictures on his computer. They had Facebook messages of him talking to the types of girls he liked and the things he liked to do. He bragged about being able to molest girls in front of their parents while he did private lessons. I beat myself up for quite a while after everything came out. I had put my daughter in a place where that could happen. She was never alone with him. And like I said before, I did most of the demonstrating with her. She still doesn't know why his classes were stopped. She was 9 at the time. I felt so bad for championing him to all these other parents that were looking for classes for their young daughters. I couldn't bring myself out of a funk for quite a while. My wife, being the great woman she is, finally sat me down, explained to me that I was duped by the instructor just as much as everyone else was, that I wasn't at fault for the things he had done. He had the wool over everyone's eyes. I couldn't beat myself up over it. There were multiple charges against him. I hoped he would rot in prison for all he had done, but after 1.5 years, he ended up just getting 3 charges that equaled 10 years. If you read this on air, and then in quotes, parents, be mindful of what's going on with your kids. If your kid tells you something is off, believe them. Listen to their concerns. Don't force them to go back to some place if they are uncomfortable with that person. Thanks for all the work you put into these podcasts, sir. They make my days easier, Greg. Well, thank you, Greg. That was a fucking great message. You're right, for starters. It was not your fault. These bastards are typically highly, highly skilled manipulators. They dupe parents just like they dupe minors, like they dupe law enforcement often, which is why, sadly, without getting as paranoid as some of the investigators I talked about today, you shouldn't trust anybody with your kids, not implicitly, and talk to your kids. Often listen to your kids, trust your gut. That's great advice. I have to speak in code now, not to break somebody's trust, I know, but I spoke recently with some type of authority figure, let's just say, about somebody in the periphery of an underage family member of mine. And I just spoke about somebody who creeps me the fuck out. Somebody I've been taking mental notes on for a little while, things that bother me about this person, things I've heard and seen, hearsay, nothing illegal, but behavior if true, indicative of somebody who is likely a predator. And when I spoke with this person in authority, I found that others have also been calling in and talking about them as well. So I'm going to keep watching. I'm going to keep listening. And if this fucker ever does anything I hear about that I can prove, they're going to go down. In the meantime, this family member of mine will never, ever be alone with him. Not fucking ever. I'll keep shooting them looks, this person. When I see them, they'll probably have them worrying about me being a maniac that might try and kill him. And that's the best you can do, right? Be skeptical, parents. Be skeptical. Listen to your kids. Again, listen to your gut. Be very, very fucking careful about who you leave your kids alone with. And now one more from a kick-ass anonymous sucker who caught my attention with the subject line of Larry Nassar was my doctor for 11 years. And they write, "Hey, Dan, I've always wanted a reason to write into the show. I've been a listener since my husband turned me on to the Nexium episode, as I'm obsessed with cults. Oh, me too, as you know. I hoped I would have had a much more charming reason to write in than Larry Nassar be my doctor for 11 years, but here I am. I want to be upfront and clear that Nassar did not sexually assault me, but I wanted to write in to provide clarity and further information, as I'm sure the chances of another gymnast who saw him being a listener are close to none. While I express victimization at being Nassar's patient, I will never try to compare my experiences to those of his assault survivors. I know this message might be too long to read as an update. Feel free to squeeze it in if you can. I was a gymnast for 16 years. I saw Nassar from age 11 to age 22 for hip and back injuries. I'm now 30. I often think back about how allegations date back to before I was born, his allegations, and how many girls could have been saved in that span of my life. To this day, I wonder why he never assaulted me. Maybe he thought my parents or I would speak up. Maybe I wasn't his type. I will never know, but will be grateful for the rest of my life. Unfortunately, that doesn't mean I wasn't also mishandled and mistreated in his care. Nassar diagnosed me in 2010 with 3 back fractures, treated me accordingly for the next 6 years. 14 years later, I still have a great deal of back pain and have found no other doctor that will confirm his diagnosis of a fracture. This has led me to a haunting thought that he was misdiagnosing gymnasts in addition to his mistreating to keep them coming back. While he never assaulted me vaginally, he did touch me inappropriately at every visit, not only in front of my parents, but while addressing them. First, he would make us change into a leotard so he could see our bodies better. We thought that made sense at the time, but now I know the real reasoning. After his exam and adjustments, he would debrief with my family while resting his hands on my stomach, upper thighs, or butt while still in a leotard. I will always remember the icky feeling this gave me, but I chalked it up to him being super comfortable with the human body as a doctor. And I don't think my parents noticed, as those were the places the adjustments had just taken place. You mentioned many quotes where gymnasts talked about feeling lucky to be in his care, and I truly cannot express this enough to people. We were taught to worship him and be so grateful to live near his practice. When you entered his office at MSU, he had pictures all around him with Olympic gymnasts, and it gave you a feeling of greatness, like you would hit the jackpot, like everything would be okay. And the worst part was he was a great doctor. He treated and healed many complex injuries, which only propelled his reputation and continued to allow him access to thousands of young girls. I often look back and think he wasn't just a pedophile who used his job as a reason to be close to girls. He was truly great at what he did in between, and that makes it so much more bitter to me, because he could have maintained fame for helping people, but he chose to hurt them. Now for a little insight into John Geddert. Yeah, this other piece of shit. John's gym was about 45 minutes from my gym, so we were always hearing experiences of being a Twistars gymnast. I can tell you that almost every gymnast in the state was afraid of John. He was known for producing the best athletes, but in the harshest conditions. If you had hopes of being a college gymnast or better, you went to Twistars. One day, when I was in middle school, I was competing in a gymnastics meet and was in a rotation with Twistars. During the competition, one of John's girls slipped off the bar and fell. John nearly lifted her off the ground by the neck of her leotard while screaming in her face. Crying and shaking, she had to finish her routine in front of the audience, the judges, and him. That moment was all my parents talked about on the drive home, wondering how a parent could see that and continue to send their daughter there. Years later, I went to a multi-day camp at Twistars. I wasn't afraid of going to it because I meant nothing to John, but I left telling my parents that if I came up missing, John Geddert did it. It was partially a joke, but partially a realization of the true monster he was. He made me do skills I was not ready for, made me practice on an injury I got while I was there, tried to hype us up by having us watch Jordan Weber and Cami Moore practice their elite floor routines. We all sat around the floor to cheer them on, but the cheers faded as they fell, limped, and literally sobbed through their routines, with him screaming from the corner of the floor. We idolized them and what they had, until he paraded their torture in front of us as inspiration. When the allegations first started to come out, my family and I did not know what to think. I remember checking Nassar's Facebook, because every doctor friends you on Facebook and messages you about their treatments, right? And his wall was flooded with supportive comments. Hours later, his Facebook was gone. I will never be able to unsee my parents' faces when they asked me if he ever touched me, asking dozens of times, not believing that he didn't. I will never forget their sheer panic and disgust as they reflected on how many of my teammates they referred to him when they owned my gymnastics gym. I will never forget watching the victim impact statements and seeing childhood teammate after teammate step up to the podium to speak, never knowing they went through what they did. I will never forget the doctor's appointment I went to months later, where the male doctor asked my mom to step out of the room so he could perform a pelvic exam, and the sheer panic that came out in my objection as a 24-year-old woman. I will never forget the summer I went to the Caroli camp and how my teammate and I worshiped the ground Bella walked on, feeling so lucky to be there. I will never forget how this world I grew up in for 16 years, 25 hours a week, came crashing down in a matter of hours, wrecking the lives of my best friends. I was a patient of MSU, seeing Larry Nassar for 11 consecutive years, never received notice from them of what he did. I will never forgive him for tainting the memories of 16 years of my life, ruining my favorite sport for hundreds of girls. I will never forgive him for the survivor's guilt and empathy for my friends that I will carry for the rest of my life, let alone the trauma they will carry. And I will never forgive John Geddert for being too cowardly to face what he did. Yeah, he took his own life, if you forgot. P.S. He was found in the back of the rest area by the dumpsters, just like you hoped. Sorry, not sorry for the long email, but this has weighed heavy on my mind for 6 years, and I couldn't believe you covered the topic. Anyways, thanks again for taking the time to read this anonymous sucker. Man, what a message. I felt like an idiot when I was so fucking wrapped up in your message when I read it earlier today. I literally just started clapping, like by myself, when you told me John's body was found by the dumpster. Like I was listening to you give this amazing presentation in front of an audience instead of just being alone with my computer. I don't think anybody caught me doing that, or if they did, they didn't acknowledge it. It was just me and Kyler home. He didn't acknowledge it. I'd never thought of the survivor's guilt angle, how these fucks, victimized even more people than all the girls they abused and all the friends and families of those girls. I am so glad you have awesome protective parents. And you know what? If you want your fucking mom to still come in for your exams when you're 40 and she's okay with that, you know what? Bring your fucking mom. It's your body. Whatever makes you comfortable. She's not hurting anything. I hope you are able to at least enjoy watching gymnastics today. I mean, it is so full of, as you know, being a former, well, I don't know, you might be a current athlete yourself still, but just being such an amazing athlete, it is so impressive. It is so beautiful. And I hope like scandals like this don't ruin it. So many people in that sport who are definitely, I'm sure not dirtbags. Thanks for sending in your story. It hit me, and I'm sure it'll resonate with a lot of others.
Next time, suckers, I needed that.
We all did.
Thanks for listening to another Bad Magic Productions podcast. Scared to Death, Timesuck each week. Short Sucks and Nightmare Fuel on the Timesuck and Scared to Death podcast feed some weeks. Thank you for the great feedback, many of you Timesuckers, about Nightmare Fuel. Please don't take up a new hobby of hiding in the hills at night outside the city and jerking off while you watch people fucking cars. We have a lot of porn online now where you can indulge in your voyeuristic fantasies. And you can watch it ethically, exploitation free on porn sites like Bellesa, BELLESA.co. So just do that. Just stay home. Don't be a creep. Watch people who want to be watched while they keep on sucking.
Bad Magic Productions.
I love this button so much. I hope when you hear it now, you think about a bunch of Italian police officers in the 70s and 80s, not giving a single fuck about a crime scene, letting anyone and everyone just trample important evidence while they smoke cigarettes, talk about fucking each other's wives. And maybe you'll think about this. Maserati Bugatti Spaghetti! Maserati Bugatti Spaghetti! Maserati Bugatti Spaghetti! Luigi Pizza Pie! Luigi Pizza Pie! Luigi Pizza Pie! Maserati Bugatti Spaghetti! Maserati Bugatti Spaghetti! Maserati Bugatti Spaghetti! Luigi Pizza Pie. It was really hard to time that.